Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever seen something that you couldn't explain? Something that didn't fit into the world you knew? I have. And I regret not walking away the moment I saw it. It was a quiet evening, just like any other. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the dry fields of my farm in Texas. The wind carried the smell of earth and dust, and the only sounds were the distant chirp of crickets and the faint hum of the tractor still running in the distance. The day was winding down, and I was ready to call it quits. My hands ached from a long day of work, and the last thing I wanted was to deal with another mystery. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That's why I saw it. At first, it was just a small dot of green light in the distance, barely noticeable. I thought it was a trick of the setting sun, some weird reflection off the metal parts of the old irrigation system. But as I squinted, I realized the light was hovering above the field, hovering in the same spot, just out of reach of the fading sunlight. I stood still for a moment, watching it. It wasn't moving. It wasn't blinking. Just a steady, faint green glow floating inches above the soil. And the strangest thing? It didn't seem to be affected by the fading light of dusk. It didn't belong. Curiosity pulled me toward it, and before I even realized it, I found myself walking toward the field. My boots scraped against the dirt as I moved closer. The light was still there, hanging in the air like it had been waiting for me. It wasn't big, no larger than a marble, perhaps, but it had a strange presence. A weight to it. I was maybe 20 feet away when it changed. The light grew, expanding slowly, its intensity increasing until it was the size of a baseball. It wasn't supposed to do that. I stopped in my tracks, suddenly unsure of whether I should take another step. My pulse quickened. Something was off. The air around me seemed to shift. The wind died down, and all I could hear was the soft thud of my heartbeat in my chest. The light wasn't just glowing now, it was pulsing, like it was breathing. It seemed to pull at the air around it, distorting the space around it as if it was bending reality itself. A chill ran through my spine, and I hesitated, unsure of what to do next. It felt wrong. And then, without warning, it darted away from me, zooming into the distance. I froze, eyes wide, heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't seen it move, but it was already at the far edge of the field, just a small pinpoint of green light again. I took a step forward, instinctively following it. The ground beneath me felt different now. The usual dirt that clung to my boots felt odd. Slick. Almost as though the earth itself was changing, reacting to the light. The more I walked, the further the light moved, keeping the same distance between us. Every time I got closer, it would dart a few steps farther away, never allowing me to reach it. A creeping unease settled into my gut. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Something was pulling me toward it, something that I couldn't explain. But as I moved closer to the point where the light had last been, I noticed something else. The ground around it was different. The crops I had planted weeks ago were gone. Vanished. Where there had been rows of corn, beans, and wheat, there was nothing. Just barren earth, cracked and empty. as if the crops had been torn away, ripped from the ground, and left to decay without a trace. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't make sense. The light, it had something to do with this. There was no other explanation. I was standing on the edge of the field now, the darkening sky above me and the empty soil below. The green light flickered, growing again, this time much larger, brighter. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears as I stepped into the emptiness, moving cautiously, trying to make sense of what was happening. Suddenly, the light shot upward, so fast I barely had time to react. It moved like a flash of lightning, disappearing into the sky with a soft, almost imperceptible hum. I stood still for a long moment, staring at the empty field in disbelief. Where the crops had once been, there was nothing but dust. No green. No life. Just an empty patch of earth where everything had been wiped away. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I turned, walking slowly back toward the barn. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure: something had changed. And whatever it was still out there. The light had gone, but the emptiness remained. And as I reached the barn door, I couldn't shake the feeling that the field, my field, wasn't done with me yet. I didn't sleep that night. The events in the field, the vanishing crops, the green light, it all played over and over in my mind like some sort of sick loop. I kept telling myself it was just a freak occurrence, a trick of the eye. But the more I thought about it, the less I could convince myself that it was natural. The whole thing felt wrong, like a part of the world had suddenly gone sideways, and I had stumbled right into it. I stayed up, pacing around the barn, staring at the darkened window. The sounds of the night, the distant chirps of the insects, the rustle of the trees in the wind, they all felt foreign now. Every noise seemed amplified, as though something was lurking in the silence, waiting for the right moment to make its move. It wasn't just the crops that were gone. There was a strange energy in the air, a tension that felt like it was building up, waiting to snap. By the time the first rays of dawn crept through the cracks in the barn's walls, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. I had to see if it was real. I grabbed my jacket, slipped on my boots, and walked outside, feeling the chill of the early morning air bite at my skin. The field was still there, empty, lifeless, just as I had left it. The soil was dry and cracked, the air still heavy with the strange sense of something wrong. I could see where the crops should have been, the rows of plants that should have been pushing through the earth. But instead, it was barren. No signs of life. No growth. But there, in the distance, in the same spot I'd seen the green light, I noticed something else. A faint glow. Not the same intense, bright green from the night before, but a dull, flickering light, like a dying ember. It was barely visible, but it was there. My breath caught in my throat. The light, it was back. I didn't think. I just started walking toward it again. This time, though, I was more cautious, my steps slower, more deliberate. I had learned my lesson last night. I wasn't going to just rush into this blindly. As I got closer, the light began to grow again, pulsing in the same erratic pattern. But something was different this time. I could hear a soft humming sound, low, almost imperceptible, like a vibration deep in the earth. It wasn't a sound I could place, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The closer I got, the stronger the vibration became, and the more the ground beneath my feet seemed to hum with energy. I stopped when I was only a few feet away from the light. It was now about the size of a basketball, its glow bright and unsettling against the barren soil. My heart raced, and I found myself holding my breath. The air around me felt thick, oppressive, as though it was pressing down on me, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the light was drawing me in, pulling me closer to something I couldn't yet see. The wind shifted suddenly, and I felt it, a brief, cold gust that made my skin crawl. The vibration under my feet intensified, and I swore the ground trembled just slightly. And then, just like before, the light shot up into the air with blinding speed, disappearing into the sky in a flash. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I didn't know what I was running from, but I couldn't stay there. Something deep inside told me I had to get away from that spot, from that light, before it was too late. As I sprinted back toward the barn, I could feel the pulse of the ground beneath me, the vibration still echoing in the air. When I reached the barn, I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against it, gasping for breath. My mind was racing. What was happening to the land? Why were the crops disappearing? And what was that light? I could feel the walls closing in on me, the weight of the unknown pressing down on my chest. There had to be an explanation. There had to be something logical behind all of this. But every time I thought I was close to figuring it out, another piece of the puzzle slipped away from me, just out of reach. And then, as if the universe itself was mocking me, the lights in the barn flickered. Just for a moment. A brief flicker, as if someone had flipped the switch. And then they went out completely, leaving me in the darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness, but the air in the barn felt wrong. The hum from the field, the same hum that had vibrated through the earth earlier, seemed to echo here, now filling the barn with an unsettling energy. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. I turned quickly, scanning the corners of the barn. But all I saw were the familiar tools and farm equipment. Still, the sensation of being watched lingered. I was about to dismiss it when I noticed something strange, a soft glow coming from beneath the barn floor, from the cracks between the wooden planks. It wasn't like the light from the field. This one was pale, almost sickly, and it was pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat. The same vibration from the field. It was here now, too. And it was getting stronger. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening out there, in that field, was starting to follow me. And it wasn't going to stop until it had taken everything. I had to find out what was going on before it was too late. But deep down, I knew. I had already waited too long. I couldn't breathe. The air around me felt dense, like it was pushing down on my chest. I stood frozen, staring at the faint glow coming from the cracks in the barn floor. The soft, rhythmic pulse, it was like the heartbeat of something alive, something that shouldn't be. My flashlight flickered in my hand, casting eerie shadows across the barn's wooden beams, making everything look like it was shifting. The humming sound, so faint at first, was now unmistakable, vibrating through the floorboards, rising in intensity with each passing second. It was like something was trying to get out. Or worse, trying to pull me in. I took a step back, my heart racing. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as I could. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave without understanding what was happening. What was happening to the land, to the crops, to me? I knelt down, my hands trembling, and touched the cold, cracked floor. The sensation was wrong. It wasn't just the coldness. It was as if the wood itself was alive, reacting to my touch. The surface seemed to shift beneath my palm, subtly, but enough to make me pull my hand away. There was a sound then, a soft scraping noise from underneath the floorboards. I froze. I wasn't imagining it. There was something moving beneath me. My mind raced. What could it be? An animal? Something buried under the floor? I reached for the nearest tool, a rusty crowbar, and hesitated. The thought of tearing up the barn floor, not knowing what I'd find, sent a cold shiver down my spine. But I had to know. I had to see for myself. I positioned the crowbar into one of the larger gaps in the wood and pried it open with all the strength I could muster. The barn creaked, the floorboards groaned in protest. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I worked to loosen the planks. It took several minutes, but I finally managed to pry up one of the larger boards. Beneath it was a small cavity, dark and narrow. And then, as I leaned in closer, I saw it, a thin, greenish thread, almost translucent, curling like a vine. It pulsed, just like the light I had seen in the field. A soft, sickly glow radiated from it, casting an unsettling light in the small space beneath the floor. The thread was moving. It wasn't just lying there. It was alive. I pulled back quickly, my chest tightening. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural. I didn't know what to do. I stood there, my breath shallow, staring at the eerie glow beneath the floor, trying to make sense of it all. My mind was racing, flipping through every possibility, trying to find a logical explanation, but there was nothing. There was no science, no natural law that could explain this. Nothing that could account for the strange light in the field, the crops disappearing, the strange vibration in the air. And that's when I heard it, the sound of something moving, faint but unmistakable. I turned quickly. At first, I thought it was the wind. But then I saw the shadows in the corners of the barn shifting. No wind, no movement. The shadows just moved. As if they were separate from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. They were alive. My stomach lurched. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. I stumbled backward, away from the shadows, my heart pounding. The light beneath the floor was growing brighter now, more intense, and the pulsing sound was louder. It wasn't just under the floor anymore. It was everywhere, vibrating through the air, through the walls. I felt it in my bones. I glanced toward the door, the only way out. But something was wrong. The shadows, they were crawling toward it, creeping across the floor like tendrils, blocking my escape. I couldn't get to the door. Suddenly, the barn went completely still. The vibrating stopped, the light beneath the floor dimmed to nothing. The silence was suffocating. I stood there, frozen, eyes darting from one corner of the barn to the next, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the longer I waited, the more the silence seemed to press in on me, like it was waiting for something, like it was expecting me to move. And then, without warning, a loud crack split the air. I turned to see the floor beneath the spot where I had just been standing begin to splinter. The wooden boards buckled, and a dark, swirling mass began to emerge from the cracks. It was a black, smoke-like substance, twisting and writhing, trying to break through the surface. It moved with terrifying speed, like a living thing, a creature desperate to get out. The mass spread out, engulfing everything in its path, and I realized, with a sickening certainty, that it wasn't just the barn that was in danger. It was the entire farm. The land was being consumed. I backed up again, nearly stumbling in my panic, but it was already too late. The mass reached the walls, and I could feel it in the air, like a pressure building, waiting to crush me. The barn was no longer a place of safety, it had become a trap. I had no choice but to run. I darted for the door, the shadows still stretching toward me, their dark fingers grazing my legs as I passed. But just as I reached for the door handle, I felt it, a cold hand, ice cold, gripping my wrist. I screamed, but the sound didn't come. The pressure in my chest was unbearable. The air felt thick with static. The darkness pressed in on me from all sides. And then everything went black. I woke with a start, my chest heaving, heart pounding in my ears. My hands were still gripping the door frame, the cold metal handle biting into my palm as if I hadn't moved since the moment I grabbed it. I blinked, confused, trying to make sense of the darkness surrounding me. The barn was still there, the same rough-hewn wooden walls, the old beams above me, the same faint smell of hay and damp earth. But something was off. The air was thick, almost as if the very atmosphere had changed, more oppressive, heavier. I stood still, eyes scanning the shadows, expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. My breath came out in shaky bursts, and yet everything seemed normal. Too normal. But that feeling, the one that had clawed at the back of my mind earlier, was still there, lingering in the corners of my thoughts. It was like a slow, creeping unease that seemed to vibrate in the air around me, making my skin prickle. The barn felt as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stepped forward cautiously, my boots scraping against the floorboards, the sound loud in the heavy silence. The faint green glow that had been pulsing beneath the barn's floor was gone. But I wasn't convinced that whatever had caused it was gone, too. It hadn't just disappeared. It was still here. In the walls, in the ground beneath me. My fingers brushed against the floorboards, and the vibrations I'd felt earlier returned, small, almost imperceptible, but there. The wood was alive in a way I couldn't explain. I leaned down, my breath catching, straining to hear the faint hum again, the thrum that had been echoing through my bones. But all I heard was the rush of my own heartbeat. Then, a soft scrape echoed from somewhere deep within the barn. My body froze. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to hear it. But my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I turned, eyes drawn to the back of the barn, to the farthest corner where the shadows were thickest. That's where it had come from, the first sensation of wrongness. I stepped forward, the air around me suddenly heavy, as though the walls were closing in. Every creak of the wood beneath my boots seemed to amplify. Every whisper of the wind outside felt like a scream trying to claw its way inside. The shadows shifted again. A figure moved within the dark, so faint it might have been my imagination. But then, it moved again, closer, distinct, like it was stalking me. My stomach turned. I knew I should run, but my feet were glued to the ground. I couldn't look away. The darkness itself seemed to be swallowing the edges of the barn, like it was expanding, growing larger. I tried to swallow, to force my mouth to move, but it felt as if something was lodged in my throat. It was like the very air had thickened, making it hard to breathe. The figure grew clearer as it approached. I could see it now, a shape, barely human, with long, thin limbs that seemed to bend in unnatural ways. Its movements were jerky, quick, like it wasn't used to being in a body at all. The eyes, if they could be called eyes, were black voids, sucking in the dim light around it like they were holes in the world. And the smell was worse than anything I'd ever encountered. Wet earth, decay, the stench of something long buried and forgotten. My instincts screamed at me to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't respond. I stood there, frozen, unable to break free from its pull. The thing was getting closer. I reached for the crowbar that was still lying on the ground, my hand trembling as I gripped it. But it didn't matter. The moment I moved, the creature lunged. I didn't have time to react before it was upon me, its cold, clammy hands gripping my shoulders, its breath rank with rot and death. I tried to scream, but the sound was choked off, muffled by the overwhelming sense of suffocation that closed in on me. The air crackled, and for a split second, everything felt wrong, like the very fabric of reality was tearing, unraveling around us. I could see flashes of something beyond this world. A place where the sky was thick with swirling black clouds, where the land was barren and lifeless, where the earth itself seemed to breathe in agony. It was a glimpse too brief to fully understand, but long enough to send a shock through my bones. I struggled, fighting against its grip, but it didn't seem to care. Its fingers dug into my skin, pulling me closer, and for a moment, I thought I was being dragged into the shadows themselves. I couldn't see anymore. The darkness had swallowed me whole, and there was nothing but that horrible, suffocating blackness. And then, just like that, the pressure lifted. I fell backward, gasping for air, my lungs burning as though I had been drowning. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my vision, but everything was blurry, indistinct. My heart thundered in my chest, each beat loud enough to drown out everything else. I was on the barn floor now, the creature gone, but the feeling of being watched never left. It was as if the very air around me had changed, like the barn had shifted, become something else, something darker. I felt a lingering presence, something watching, waiting. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I pushed myself up, wiping the sweat from my forehead. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer. But just as I reached the door, I stopped. In the distance, across the field, there it was again. That green light. It was pulsing, brighter than before. And it was moving closer. I wasn't safe. None of us were. I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the cursed green light. It pulsed in the distance, faint but undeniable, hovering just above the earth, flickering like a dying flame. For a moment, I thought about running. I could feel the tremble in my legs, urging me to turn and flee, but I knew it was no use. Whatever that light was, it had been following me ever since that first night in the field, and now I was sure it was leading me to something far worse than anything I could imagine. The barn door felt too far, too unreachable. My breath was shallow, my chest tight with the pressure of both fear and the suffocating air that seemed to thicken around me. The barn, which had always been a place of safety, now felt like a prison. Even the old wooden beams above me felt alien, as if they were closing in. I couldn't let it happen again. The creature, whatever it had been, wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it had come for me once already. There was no telling how many more would follow if I didn't do something now. I made my way toward the door, moving quickly, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. It was as if something was out there, just beyond the edge of my vision, slipping in and out of the shadows. The air crackled, like static electricity filling every inch of space. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the distant hum of that green light. The barn door opened with a groan, the hinges protesting under the strain, but I didn't care. I didn't stop to think about the danger. I needed to get out there, needed to confront whatever was happening. If I stayed in this barn, I was as good as trapped. I stepped out into the field, the night air cold against my skin, the ground beneath me uneven and soft. The green light flickered again, closer now, no more than a few hundred yards away. It seemed to hover, its intensity growing with each passing second. And then I saw it, a shape, too faint to make out at first, but unmistakable once it became clearer. Something was moving toward me, a dark, shifting shadow that blended into the land, barely visible against the backdrop of the night. I stumbled back, my heart thundering in my chest. It was moving too quickly, like it was not bound by the same rules of time and space as anything else in this world. I tried to scream, but the sound was caught in my throat, muffled by an overwhelming pressure in the air. My mind raced, scrambling for an explanation, but nothing made sense. The green light, the thing I had seen in the barn, and the terrifying sense that whatever this was, it had a purpose. A purpose that was linked to me. I thought of the stories people told, the ones about strange lights in the sky, disappearances, things lost to time. But this wasn't a story. This was real. My feet moved before I had a chance to stop them. I wasn't thinking. I was running, but there was nowhere to go. The thing in the distance wasn't going to let me escape. I could hear the alarm now, louder than ever before, vibrating through the ground beneath my boots. It was like the earth itself was alive, breathing in time with the sound. A strange energy pulsed in the air, and I could feel it, could almost taste it in the back of my throat. It was too much. It was all too much. I kept running, the green light growing closer, the shadowy shape moving in a zigzagging pattern that didn't make sense. It was as if it was everywhere at once, at the edges of my vision, shifting in and out of focus. And then the ground beneath me seemed to shift, the earth buckling and twisting like a living thing, and I lost my balance, falling hard onto the dirt. For a moment, everything was still. The light flickered once more, closer, almost blinding now. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, pounding in my head, so loud I thought it might split my skull. The shape loomed above me. I forced myself to look up, eyes wide in terror, and there it was. The thing, part man, part something else entirely. Its form was shifting, flickering, as though it didn't quite belong in this world. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and its skin was pale, deathly pale, like it had been bleached by some unnatural force. It moved with a jerky fluidity that made my stomach churn. Its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were empty black pits, absorbing every ounce of light around them like they were pulling me into them. I could feel myself falling into those pits, unable to tear my gaze away, paralyzed by the unnatural force that radiated from the creature. "Get away," I muttered under my breath, the words barely audible, but they felt like a plea for help. I didn't know who I was asking. I didn't know who could save me. The air crackled again. The green light flickered and pulsed, and something sharp, like a thorn in my mind, pressed against my thoughts. A voice, not in my ears, but in my head, whispered through the dark, threading its way into my consciousness. "You shouldn't have looked." The words were cold, chilling in their finality. I scrambled backward, my hands digging into the dirt as I tried to pull myself away, but the creature loomed over me. The pressure in the air was unbearable now. It was like being inside a storm, the chaos of it building, suffocating me. I had to run. I had to escape. But before I could move, before I could even think, the creature reached down with its long, bony fingers and the world went black. Have you ever wondered what it would be like if the things you used every day, the things you took for granted, suddenly became alive? What if the objects you trusted, the ones you thought you knew, started moving when you weren't looking? That thought has been gnawing at me ever since the first night it happened. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Emily, and I've been working as an assistant at a small dental practice in Ohio for the past 2 years. The clinic isn't exactly bustling, but it's steady work. I spend most of my days helping Dr. Reynolds, a kind but somewhat eccentric dentist, prepare for appointments, take x-rays, clean tools, and assist with dental procedures. It's routine, comfortable even. But lately, that comfort has been slipping away, replaced by something else, a sense of unease, something I can't quite explain. It started about a month ago, around the middle of the month. Dr. Reynolds had asked me to stay late one night to help him with some paperwork. He had an early appointment the next morning, and we needed to clear the backlog. I didn't mind. It wasn't the first time I'd stayed late at the office, and I had always found the quiet, after-hours atmosphere to be oddly calming. That night, though, was different. The moment I entered the lab, I noticed a strange stillness in the air. The fluorescent lights above hummed as usual, casting their sterile glow over the rows of dental tools and models. The lab itself was a small, somewhat cramped room tucked away in the back of the clinic, filled with workbenches, microscopes, and the hum of the dental equipment. It was an orderly space, a space I had come to know well over the years. But tonight, it felt off. There was a faint smell in the air, something sharp, like chemicals, but it didn't quite sit right, almost metallic. I chalked it up to the cleaning solvents we used, or perhaps the leftover disinfectants from the morning. The smell was just in the air, no different from any other day. I moved to the workbench and began organizing some of the dental prosthetics Dr. Reynolds had finished working on earlier. They were neat and orderly, each one sitting on its own labeled tray, ready for fitting or adjustment. It was as I was arranging them that I first heard it. A faint click. At first, I thought it was nothing, a simple sound, like the shift of a tool or maybe the settling of a chair. But then, there it was again, a soft, unmistakable click from the far corner of the room. I froze. It wasn't a sound that belonged here, not in this place. The lab was always quiet, except for the low hum of the machines or the rustle of paper. But this was something different. I looked around the room, my eyes scanning the familiar surroundings, trying to place the source of the sound. Nothing had changed. The dental molds were where they had always been. The tools were organized neatly on their trays. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet, that click, it came again. I turned toward the source, the tray with the newly finished dentures. There, sitting on the far side of the workbench, the dentures had shifted. Not much, but enough that I could tell. The upper row of teeth had moved slightly, as though they had repositioned themselves just a millimeter to the right. I stared at them, trying to reason away the strange occurrence. Maybe I had nudged them without noticing. Or perhaps the vibrations from the lab equipment had caused them to shift. I reached over and gently adjusted the dentures, making sure they were aligned properly. My fingers trembled slightly as I did. It was absurd. Dentures couldn't move on their own. They were just objects. But the doubt began to gnaw at me. I tried to shake it off. It's just the stress, I muttered to myself, brushing my hands together and standing up straight. No need to freak out. I began working again, my thoughts trying to return to the task at hand. But then, click. Again. My eyes darted back to the dentures. They hadn't moved, but the sound was unmistakable. I could hear it now, a low, sharp clicking, like the sound of teeth grinding together. I swallowed, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. I should have left. I should have gone home, told Dr. Reynolds I was too tired, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I couldn't bring myself to move. The clicking continued, now more frequent, more pronounced. It was as if the dentures were alive. I turned away quickly, trying to focus on anything else. It was just my imagination, I told myself. There was no reason to be scared. Nothing had changed. Nothing was wrong. Then, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of something scraping against the metal of the tray. I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat. The dentures were moving. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but the upper row of teeth had shifted again, as if some invisible hand had pushed them. The sound was coming from the inside of the dentures themselves. A grinding, scraping noise, followed by another click as the lower jaw shifted slightly to the left. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. The clicking sound grew louder, more frantic, as if the dentures were trying to speak, trying to move on their own. That was when I noticed the other trays. The dentures on the other side of the room, ones that had been set aside, waiting for their final adjustments, were moving too. Slowly at first, but then with more urgency. The teeth clacked together, and the trays began to shift across the workbenches, as if some invisible force was pulling them toward the center of the room. My stomach twisted. I had to get out of here. But as I turned to flee, the lights above me flickered. And that was when I heard it, the low, deep scrape of something that sounded far worse than just a prosthetic. It was a whisper. A voice, faint but clear, from somewhere in the darkness behind me. A sound so chilling, it froze me to the core. "Emily, come closer." I didn't move. I couldn't. The room seemed to close in around me, and that whisper, that horrible voice, it continued, growing louder, more insistent. And that was when I realized I wasn't alone in the lab. I didn't move. I couldn't. The voice, it wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was real. The faint whisper that had come from behind me echoed through the lab, low and almost intimate, like it was speaking directly to me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, a cold shiver running down my spine. "Emily, come closer." The voice had said my name, drawn out, almost coaxing. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no one else in the room. The clinic was locked, the other staff had long gone home hours ago. But this voice, it wasn't human. It wasn't Dr. Reynolds. It was something else entirely. I didn't dare turn around. Instead, I looked at the dentures, the instruments, the trays. Everything in the room was still moving, clicking, scraping, grinding against one another. The dentures on the workbench weren't simply shifting now. They were crawling, sliding inch by inch, pulling toward the center of the room as if they had a will of their own. I backed away slowly, inch by inch, my eyes darting around the lab for anything that could make sense of this nightmare. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights above was now drowned out by the unsettling noise of the prosthetics shifting, clicking, and grinding. It was like the whole room was alive, the objects vibrating with an eerie energy. Then, I noticed something worse. The lights flickered again, this time more violently. The air seemed to grow colder, and a strange pressure built in the room, like a weight settling on my chest. The light above the workbench buzzed erratically before going completely out, plunging the lab into near darkness. The only illumination now came from the glow of the emergency exit sign on the far wall and the faint light from the hallway outside the door. The room felt wrong. I knew, with a deep, visceral certainty, that I wasn't alone. It was like the walls were closing in around me, and the space I had once known so well had transformed into something foreign. A place that should have been safe felt like a trap. Another scrape. This one came from behind me. I jerked my head toward the sound, my breath shallow and rapid. There, on the floor near the trays, I saw the shadow move. Something was there. But when I looked, all I could see was the growing pile of moving dentures, clattering together like they were trying to form something, trying to connect. And then it happened. I saw it. In the dim light, one of the dentures on the floor stopped moving, frozen for a moment before the teeth began to stretch, the jawline extending unnaturally. A grotesque snap echoed through the room as the prosthetic teeth connected and locked together, as though the object was slowly becoming alive. I gasped, my heart skipping a beat. The clattering noise was now joined by a low, grinding, almost wet sound, like something was shifting beneath the surface. The dentures, they weren't just moving. They were growing, expanding. And as I watched, the rows of teeth twisted together into a shape I could barely comprehend. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking. What was this? What in the world was happening? And then, the whisper again. Closer. It was so much louder now, and it was coming from all directions at once. From the trays. From the walls. From the teeth that had gathered on the floor. Closer. Emily. The sound wrapped around me, suffocating me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth was dry, like my throat had closed up. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to get out. I spun on my heels, rushing toward the door. The shadows behind me stretched long, twisting in unnatural shapes as if they were chasing me, following me. My pulse roared in my ears as I grabbed the handle of the door. It wouldn't budge. I twisted the handle again, harder this time, panic bubbling up inside me like a wave. I had to get out. I had to get away from whatever this was. But the door remained locked, the cold steel unyielding. A sharp click came from behind me, too close, too loud. I froze, fear seizing my chest. I turned, slowly, dread creeping over me. The dentures on the floor had changed. They had come together into a single mass, an undulating, twisting shape that now stood upright. It wasn't a simple pile of prosthetics anymore. It had grown, evolved, its form shifting, mutating before my eyes. The teeth, the dental implants, the false jaws, all pressed against one another, some still clicking, others grinding, as if trying to communicate something that I couldn't understand. I took a step back, then another, my mind struggling to comprehend the horror before me. The thing, whatever it was now, seemed to be aware of me, its grotesque form shifting closer, slowly but with determination. The whisper continued, drawing out my name. Emily, come closer. I could feel its presence now. It was not just a collection of prosthetics. It was something far worse. It was alive. And it wanted me. I stumbled back, hitting the wall, my body shaking with terror. I had to get out. I had to find a way to escape. But as I scrambled for the door again, I heard the sound of more clicking, more grinding. The thing was moving. It was getting closer. My mind raced for an answer, for something, anything, to stop this nightmare. I grabbed the nearest tool, one of the metal picks used for adjusting dentures, and held it in front of me like a weapon. The thing stopped for a brief moment, the clicking halting, as if it was studying me. Then, with a sudden, horrifying crack, the mass of teeth lurched forward, the force knocking the tool from my hands. I screamed, a raw, animal scream as the thing lunged at me, its sharp, jagged teeth flashing in the dim light. And then, I felt it. The pressure. The weight. It was like 1,000 little pinpricks digging into my skin, wrapping around me, binding me in place. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The thing was inside me now. I don't know how much time passed, but when I finally came to my senses, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The oppressive, ear-splitting silence. The air, thick and stale, pressed against my skin like a heavy blanket. I was still standing by the door, my back pressed against the cold steel, my hands clutching at the handle as if I could will it to open. But the worst part was that the thing was gone. The floor was littered with the same dentures that had, moments before, been alive, twisting and growing with unnatural intent. But now, they were just scattered. They looked like any ordinary batch of dentures, disassembled and carelessly abandoned. Nothing about them screamed danger. Nothing about them was alive. Except they had been. And deep down, I knew it wasn't over. My head spun. The nausea returned. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to gather my thoughts. Maybe I had imagined it. No, I knew I hadn't. It wasn't possible. But as I opened my eyes again, the lab remained eerily still, and for a moment, I dared to hope that everything I had seen, everything I had experienced, was just a nightmare. Maybe I was still dreaming. I swallowed hard. My dry throat made it difficult to breathe. I needed to get out of here. I needed to leave this godforsaken place before whatever was happening to me took hold any further. I made my way to the desk, my legs shaking beneath me. The clock on the wall showed 2:15 in the morning. Time seemed to stretch like rubber, each passing second heavier than the last. I was losing my mind. I had to be. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the stillness. I tried to steady my breath as I reached the desk, hands trembling as I grabbed my phone from where I had left it charging. There were no missed calls, no messages. I wanted to call Dr. Reynolds, tell him what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Would he believe me? Would anyone? I couldn't even bring myself to speak the words aloud. The teeth were alive. I glanced at the cabinets, my stomach tightening at the thought of them, but something caught my eye. A small, metallic glint from the corner of the room. One of the trays, the one I had been working on before the terror had started, was missing. I hadn't touched it. It had been right next to me on the counter, but now the space was empty. I took a step toward the corner, my breath hitching as I noticed something strange on the floor, tracks. Tiny indentations in the dust, leading toward the small supply closet in the far corner. My pulse quickened. I had been careful to clean up the lab earlier. There hadn't been any marks. No mess. But these were new. Fresh. The tracks were unmistakable, a trail of small, uneven steps dragging across the floor almost like something had been pulled along. I felt a creeping dread building inside me, my mind screaming at me to stop, to turn away, to get out, but my legs moved on their own. It was as though something else, something darker, was compelling me forward. The closet door was slightly ajar, as though someone, or something, had recently passed through. It was too quiet now, too still. And that nagging sensation returned, that feeling of being watched, as if every corner of the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I hesitated at the door, my hand frozen above the handle. Should I open it? Was I prepared to face whatever was in there? My heart raced, but I couldn't stop now. I had to know. I had to find out what was happening to me. With one swift motion, I pushed the door open. The sight that greeted me sent ice running through my veins. The tray, the one I had thought was missing, it was there, placed on the floor of the closet, the teeth stacked carefully, perfectly arranged in neat rows. But there was something horribly wrong with them. The teeth were different now. Their shape had distorted, twisted in ways that were beyond natural. The gums, once soft and molded to fit, now looked almost alive, pulsing slightly in the dim light of the closet. A faint glow emanated from the edges of the dentures, a sickly green light that flickered intermittently. I couldn't breathe. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat, my vision swimming as I stepped back, unable to tear my eyes away from the grotesque sight. And then, in the stillness, came the sound again, the low, guttural scraping of teeth. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I slammed the closet door shut, stumbling backward, my hands flying to the handle of the door again. I twisted it, yanked it, but once again it wouldn't budge. Click. The sound came from the direction of the tray. I turned toward the closet, my chest tight with fear. My mind raced. My breathing came in short, ragged bursts. Something inside me screamed to leave, to get out of this nightmare before it consumed me, but I was rooted to the spot. The door to the closet trembled. I could hear something moving inside, scraping across the floor, shifting from side to side. It's alive. It's all alive. I slammed my fists against the door, panic rising, but the movement inside stopped. I waited. The silence was unbearable. But it wasn't over. I knew it wasn't. And then, the light overhead flickered. Once, twice. The buzzing sound of the fluorescent lights filled the air, followed by a screech. The light burst, casting the room into darkness. The door swung open before I could react. In the pitch-black lab, I heard the unmistakable sound of teeth, clicking. I spun around, my body frozen in fear. But when the lights flickered back to life, there was nothing there. The lab was empty. And yet, the faintest whisper brushed my ear. "Emily, come closer." I looked down at the floor, hard in my throat. The teeth were gone. I don't know how long I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, staring at the empty space where the tray had been moments ago. My thoughts swirled, a cyclone of confusion, terror, and disbelief. Could I have imagined it all? The movements? The clicking? But I knew better. I felt it in every fiber of my being. I tried to steady my breathing, leaning against the cold wall for support. My fingers trembled as they brushed over my phone. The screen was still black, dead, no signal. I could feel the weight of the silence press against me again, each second more oppressive than the last. The only sound was the faint echo of my heartbeat, the gentle hum of the air conditioning unit, and the rustling of my clothes as I shifted my weight. The lab looked unchanged. The cabinets were as they had been, the dental tools neatly arranged on the countertops. It was as if nothing had happened at all. But I knew something had moved in here, something was alive. It wasn't just my imagination. I needed to leave. But when I reached the door and grasped the handle, I froze. My mind screamed at me to turn back, but my body didn't obey. It was as if some invisible force had anchored me to the spot. My fingers curled tighter around the cold metal. The sound of my shallow breath filled the room, loud and jarring in the heavy silence. And then it happened. Click. It came from behind me. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, but unmistakable. A single, deliberate click, like a set of dentures snapping together. The sound was almost too quiet to hear, but the unmistakable dread that followed it was enough to stop me in my tracks. I swallowed, blinking rapidly as my gaze darted back toward the darkened corner of the lab. I turned slowly, my breath shallow, my hands now slick with cold sweat. The light above me flickered again, and I cursed under my breath, as if that would somehow break the tension. Another click, and then a scraping sound. A slow, deliberate dragging, the unmistakable noise of something hard scraping against the floor. My muscles tightened, my spine straightened as I turned toward the source of the sound. The cabinet door to the left of me, the one closest to the sink, was now ajar. Just slightly. It hadn't been like that before. In fact, I was sure I'd closed it. I took a step toward it, my legs heavy and stiff. The silence around me felt suffocating, broken only by the sound of my unsteady footsteps and the whispering drag that seemed to move in time with me. My pulse thundered in my ears as I reached for the door. Click. It wasn't just the sound of dentures now, it was the sound of something more, something alive. I knew I was being watched. I could feel it. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to know what was inside that cabinet. But I had to look. With trembling hands, I yanked the door open. There was nothing at first. Just a mess of tools, supplies, and empty plastic trays. But there, tucked at the back, hidden behind the clutter, was something that shouldn't have been there. A single, small jar. Inside it was a set of dentures, old, yellowing, and cracked in places. But what made them stand out was the faint, sickly green glow emanating from within the jar, pulsing like a heartbeat. The teeth were moving, slowly at first, but undeniably. My stomach lurched. The jar rattled slightly, the teeth shifting within it, as if something was trying to force its way out. I could hear the teeth grinding together, scraping and clicking with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. The low thrum of a buzzing noise followed, like an electric hum that reverberated through the air, making my skin prickle. And then, the teeth stopped. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat as the jar fell still. The air seemed to grow colder around me, heavier. The faint green glow dimmed, fading to a sickly pale shade, and for a moment I thought everything was over. Maybe it was just an illusion, a trick of the light, maybe? Click. The sound rang out, sharp and clear, from the direction of the tray on the counter. I spun around so quickly that my vision blurred. The tray was now moving, sliding inch by inch across the counter, as though it were being pushed by invisible hands. And the teeth, the very same ones that had been scattered across the lab earlier, were now all aligned, perfectly placed and positioned, clacking together as if they were alive, controlled by something beyond my understanding. A force. Something dark and ancient, something that didn't belong here. Something that had taken the teeth and was using them for its own purposes. I felt the room close in on me. The walls seemed to narrow, and the floor beneath me became unsteady. My legs shook violently, my mind refusing to process what was happening. My hands trembled uncontrollably. I needed to get out. I needed to leave before it came for me, before whatever was in the teeth reached out and dragged me under its control. But as I moved to the door again, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A figure. A shadow, tall and imposing, standing in the doorway. Its outline was unclear, distorted in the dim light, but I could see the faintest glint of something metallic, something sharp. I couldn't tell if it was a person or something else entirely. But the fact that I couldn't tell made it worse. The figure didn't move. It just watched. I froze. The air thickened, pressing against my lungs. The breath seemed to leave my body all at once, as if I were suffocating in the very presence of this thing, this force. I took a step back, but the door behind me refused to budge. Click. It wasn't the teeth this time. It was the sound of something else. Something close. Something alive. I turned, panic surging through me. The jar had fallen off the counter. It had rolled across the floor. And in the center of the lab, in the silence, the teeth were slowly, deliberately walking. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating. Each tiny click of the teeth as they shifted, dragging across the floor, reverberated in my skull like a dull, sickening drumbeat. I wanted to scream, but my throat had gone dry. My feet were frozen to the spot, unable to move, unwilling to move. I blinked, hoping the nightmare would end. But no! The teeth, each sharp and yellowed, were now in motion, clattering together as they crawled toward me. They weren't just rolling on the floor, they were creeping, moving like something alive. A shudder racked my body as I took a step back, and that's when I realized the full scale of what I was dealing with. The lab had transformed. It wasn't just the movement of the teeth. The entire room felt off. The air felt heavier, thicker, charged with some electric tension that made the hairs on my neck stand up. The walls seemed to grow closer. The shadows deepened. The faint buzzing, that strange hum that had started hours ago, was now louder, more insistent, as though the lab itself was alive, breathing, pulsing. The teeth didn't stop. They reached the counter where the tray had been, clacking and grinding together with increasing speed, like a predator circling its prey. It was no longer just unsettling, it was terrifying. I stumbled backward again, my hands reaching for anything to hold on to. My fingers grasped at the countertop, finding nothing but cold porcelain, slick and smooth, and then I saw it. The jar. The jar with the glowing green teeth inside. It was shaking now, rattling violently on the counter. The glow, faint before, had flared into a blinding, almost otherworldly light. The teeth inside, those same teeth that had been lying still, were now twitching as though trying to break free. The jar's lid rattled, a high-pitched screech against the glass. In that instant, I knew the truth. This wasn't just about teeth. It wasn't about the prosthetics or the strange happenings in the lab. It was something far worse. This was some dark, malevolent force, some unknown evil force that had found its way into the very core of this place, using the teeth as a vessel. But how? Why? The hum turned into a screeching buzz as the light from the jar grew, blinding me with its intensity. My eyes burned, and my mind screamed at me to turn away, to flee, but I was paralyzed, trapped in this nightmare. I could feel the vibrations from the jar coursing through the air, sending tremors through the floor. And then I saw it. A shadow moved within the blinding light, shifting, stretching, as though something else was inside the jar. Something alive. The teeth, the ones on the counter, stopped. For just a moment, a few seconds, they lay still. And that's when I heard it. A whisper. It came from the jar. At first, it was just a breath, so soft it could have been the wind. But it came again, louder. A voice, whispering words I couldn't understand in a language I couldn't place. It sounded almost pleading, desperate. As if whatever was trapped inside was trying to speak, trying to communicate. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped forward, drawn toward the jar, against my will. There was something pulling me toward it. a magnetic force, a power I couldn't resist. The teeth inside it shifted again, grinding against the glass as though they were trying to break free. Clack, clack, click. The sound was deafening now. It was everywhere, rattling in my skull. I closed my eyes, but it only got worse. The noise echoed in my head, reverberating through every inch of my body as if the world itself were being pulled apart by the force of it. And then, as if on cue, the teeth in the jar stopped moving. The hum died. The lights dimmed. The room fell silent. But not completely. The air was thick with tension, like a storm was gathering just above me, ready to explode. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, and a sudden cold swept through the room, making my breath mist in the air. It was a familiar cold. A biting, unnatural cold. I turned quickly, instinctively, as the shadows behind me seemed to grow, taking form. I could see them now, figures in the dim light, silhouettes stretching out toward me, dark and formless. The whispers came again, louder this time, like a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. The air crackled with energy, a sickening electricity that made my teeth ache. And then it hit me, the realization that everything in this room, this whole laboratory, had been part of it. The jar, the teeth, the buzzing, the shadows, all of it had been leading to this moment. It wasn't an accident. It was a plan, a purpose I couldn't even begin to comprehend. The teeth were just the beginning. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to run. But before I could take a step, I felt it, a heavy, almost crushing weight on my chest, as though something had placed its cold, bony hand over my heart. I gasped for breath, feeling the pressure building, suffocating me. The shadows behind me moved, circling, closing in. I could hear them, no longer whispers. Now they were screams. The teeth, the figures, the whispers, they were all a part of something much bigger. Something far more dangerous than I had ever realized. I reached for the door again, my hands shaking uncontrollably, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as if the entire building itself was pulling me in, trapping me here, where I could feel its presence closing in around me. And then, amidst the chaos, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the back of the lab, silhouetted against the fading light. Its features were hidden in darkness, but its eyes, they burned, glowing faintly red, like two embers in the night. I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. And then it spoke. You should have never opened the jar. Have you ever wondered if something in your house was watching you? The question echoed in my mind, lingering, heavy. It had been a quiet evening, nothing more than a typical Halloween night. At least, that's what I told myself. The wind howled outside, scraping against the windows, but inside, the house was still, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards. We had only moved into the house a few months ago, and while the walls still smelled faintly of paint and new wood, it felt like a place we could settle into. It was an old cottage, tucked away at the edge of town, and when I first saw it, I had a sense of nostalgia, like it was waiting for us. The house seemed harmless enough, with its cozy rooms and antique touches. It was the kind of home that seemed to promise comfort. But there was something strange about it. Something I couldn't put my finger on. That Halloween, we had bought a set of porcelain figurines, delicate little things meant to sit on the mantelpiece as decoration. Skeletons, witches, pumpkins, they were all exquisitely made, the kind of pieces that would look perfect for a spooky night. My wife, Emma, had picked them out at a yard sale. They'll add to the charm, she'd said, her voice as warm as ever. The figurines were beautiful, cold and perfect, like something from a distant past. They gave the house a strange feeling. Not in a bad way at first, just odd. They were arranged on the mantel with care, their blank porcelain eyes staring ahead, unblinking, as though waiting for something. It wasn't until the second night after we set them up that things started to feel off. At first, it was just a subtle shift, a crack in the silence that I couldn't quite explain. I was sitting on the couch, reading a book, when I heard it, a soft scraping noise, almost imperceptible, like fingernails lightly brushing across the wood. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, listening. But there was nothing. Just the wind outside, nothing unusual. I chalked it up to the house settling, or the wind moving the branches against the window. But that didn't explain the cold feeling creeping down my spine. The next morning, I noticed the first thing out of place. One of the porcelain figurines, the pumpkin-headed one, had shifted position. It wasn't much, just slightly to the left, but it was enough to make me question whether I had placed it that way. It was small, barely noticeable, but something about it didn't sit right. I shrugged it off, thinking I had maybe moved it myself without remembering. But then, a few days later, it happened again. This time, the figurines were more scattered. One of the witches had moved halfway across the mantel, and the skeleton had its arms stretched out, as though it had been trying to reach for something. A chill settled in my chest, and my mind raced. Could it be Emma? Maybe she was moving them to clean, though she hadn't mentioned it. I tried to brush off the discomfort. Maybe the cats had knocked them, or maybe it was just my imagination. I was too tired, too focused on other things to dwell on it. But as the week went on, the changes grew more pronounced. The sounds in the house became more frequent. Scratching, tapping, faint whispering that seemed to echo from the walls. Emma noticed it too. "Have you heard that?" she asked one night, her voice tight. I looked up from the kitchen counter, surprised. "What do you mean?" "The scratching. It's been going on for days." She seemed uneasy, shifting from one foot to the other. "And the figurines, they've been moving." I didn't know what to say. There was a heavy weight in my stomach, like something was pressing down on me. I didn't want to admit it, but the things in the house, those porcelain figures, were starting to unsettle me. Their hollow eyes seemed to follow me when I passed by, their poses more unsettling the longer I stared at them. That night, the sounds were louder. The wind had picked up, but this was something else, closer, more deliberate. I lay in bed, my eyes wide open, staring into the dark. Every small noise seemed to echo louder in the stillness. A loud thud from downstairs made me sit up straight, my heart hammering in my chest. I waited for Emma to stir beside me, but she didn't. I glanced over at her. She was asleep, her breathing soft and steady, unaware of the creeping dread that was slowly wrapping itself around the house. Another noise, a scraping again, this time from the mantel. It was unmistakable. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet hitting the cold floor. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, and tiptoed to the door. The house was silent now, as though it was holding its breath. I walked down the hallway, the wooden floors creaking beneath my weight. The living room was just ahead, its dark outline barely visible through the gloom. I reached the doorframe, holding my breath, my eyes scanning the room. Everything was still. The figurines stood on the mantel, their porcelain faces glowing faintly in the moonlight. For a moment, I thought maybe I was being ridiculous, letting my nerves get the better of me. Maybe the house was just settling after all. But then, I saw it. The pumpkin-headed figurine had moved again. Only this time, it was facing me, its empty eyes staring directly at me. A cold chill spread through me. I stepped back, my breath hitching in my throat. And that's when I heard it. A soft whisper. It wasn't from the wind. It wasn't from the house. It was coming from the figurines. I froze. The whisper wasn't loud, not even a murmur, but it was unmistakable. It was as if the air itself had shifted, the darkness gathering around me like a living thing. The soft voice was like 1,000 tiny threads brushing against my skin, pulling at the edges of my sanity. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My gaze stayed fixed on the figurines, those innocent little pieces of porcelain that had no right to make sounds, no right to make me feel this way. But there they were, their faces turned slightly, as if they were aware of my presence. Their eyes, those hollow, unblinking eyes, seemed darker now, more intense. The whisper grew louder, though still faint, too faint to make out the words, but close enough to make my skin crawl. It came from every direction, echoing in the corners of the room, bouncing off the walls. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a drum in my ears. I stepped back, my legs trembling, but my eyes never left the mantel. I wanted to turn away, to run back to the safety of the bedroom, but my feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. The figurines, though motionless, seemed to be waiting. Their stillness was more oppressive than any movement could have been. The silence between their whispers was thick, and I could feel it closing in on me. Then I saw something. It was the smallest shift, so subtle I almost thought I imagined it. The pumpkin-headed figurine, it had moved again. This time, its face had tilted, just slightly, as though it was leaning toward me. My breath caught in my throat. I had placed it perfectly still, facing forward, when we had arranged the figures just a few days ago. But now, it seemed to be leaning in, watching me. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I knew I should turn and run, but something kept me rooted in place. Was this really happening? Could it just be a trick of the light? The shadows in the room shifted, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in the dark, something moving behind the figurines. But no! No, it was just my mind, surely. I took a slow, hesitant step forward, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. The air grew colder, and I could almost feel a presence, something watching, something waiting. Without thinking, I reached out and touched the figurine. The porcelain was icy cold, colder than I had ever felt it. A chill shot up my arm, and I jerked my hand back, the sensation lingering in my fingertips. My heart raced. Then, as if on cue, the scraping sound came again. This time it was louder, sharper. I turned toward the source, toward the walls. The sound seemed to come from the very structure of the house itself, as though the house were groaning under some invisible weight. I backed away, my mind spiraling. This isn't real. It can't be real. But the whispers continued, swirling around me. I could almost feel the cold breath of whatever was lurking in the shadows, brushing against my neck. My head snapped back toward the mantel. The pumpkin figurine had moved again. Not just its head this time, its entire body had shifted. The other figurines were still, motionless, but the pumpkin had definitely moved. My pulse thundered in my ears. "Emma," I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted her to hear. My voice trembled, raw with fear. But Emma didn't respond. She was asleep, deep in the bedroom, blissfully unaware of the creeping terror that was slowly suffocating me. I couldn't stay here any longer. The house, the figurines, the whispers, they were becoming too much. I turned, half running toward the hallway, my breath shallow and quick, my chest tight as if the walls themselves were pressing on me. But as I passed the doorframe, something stopped me. A sudden, intense pressure in the air, like the weight of 1,000 eyes watching me from the dark corners of the room. I could feel it. They were watching me. A scream caught in my throat, but no sound came out. I stumbled backward, knocking into the doorframe as I turned. My eyes shot to the mantel again, and this time I saw the truth. All the figurines, every last one, had moved. The pumpkin was facing me, its hollow eyes wide and unblinking. The skeleton's bony fingers were pointing straight at me. The witch's head had turned, its gaze cold and accusatory. They weren't just in different positions. They were arranged in a way that felt deliberate, as if they were trying to tell me something. Something terrible. The whispers intensified, their voices low and sibilant, as though they were speaking directly into my mind. Words swirled around me, but I couldn't understand them. The language felt ancient, foreign, full of dread. The only thing I could hear clearly was my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears, pushing me toward the edge of panic. Then, a sound, distinct and clear, cut through the whispers. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy steps, coming from behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I knew what was behind me. I didn't need to see it. The presence, the thing that had been watching me from the shadows, was real. And it was moving closer. My feet began to move without my permission. I backed away, stumbling toward the door. But my legs felt weak, my mind foggy. I could barely breathe as the coldness in the room intensified, suffocating me. The whispers were deafening now, almost tangible, crawling under my skin. I reached the doorframe and threw it open, gasping for air, my pulse racing in my throat. And then, just as I was about to flee the room, I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the figurines, their eyes locked on me, staring into the depths of my soul. I didn't stay to find out what they wanted. I ran. My feet pounded the hardwood floor, each step faster than the last as I bolted down the hallway, desperate to escape the horrors I'd just witnessed. But the house, this house, felt different now. It felt wrong, as though the walls were closing in, pressing me into the narrow corridor. The once familiar and comforting space had transformed into a labyrinth, a maze with no exit. My breath came in short gasps, jagged and frantic. I stumbled through the dark, the shadows shifting in strange, unnatural patterns around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, followed. I was too terrified to look back. I could almost hear the soft scraping of porcelain against wood, like the figurines had come to life, silently moving, gliding after me with their cold, hollow eyes. The door to the bedroom was just ahead. I could see it in the distance, the faint outline of the doorframe. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling so violently I almost missed it. When I yanked the door open, the room felt too small, too confined. Emma lay asleep, her body turned away from me. For a moment, I thought I could escape it all. She would wake up, and everything would go back to normal. But I was wrong. I slammed the door shut behind me, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. The air in the room was thick, stifling, almost as if it was closing in on me too. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. The weight of it all, the whispers, the eyes, the oppressive presence that was still lingering in the house, was unbearable. I stood there, my back pressed to the door, staring into the dim light of the bedroom. Emma stirred slightly, murmuring something in her sleep, but didn't wake. I didn't know what to do, what to say. Should I tell her what I had seen? Or would she think I was losing my mind? I glanced back at the door, half expecting it to fly open, but it stayed shut. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Watching. Waiting. I turned to the bed. Emma lay peacefully, unaware of the nightmare unfolding just beyond her dreams. She had always been the more grounded one, the one who laughed off strange noises or unexplained events. But I wasn't laughing anymore. I wasn't even sure I could. I tiptoed over to the bed and sat down on the edge, trying not to wake her. I wanted to hold her, to feel something human, something real, in this cold and suffocating house. But as I reached out to touch her arm, my hand froze in midair. The room was different. The walls were the same, the bed, the furniture, it all looked like I remembered, but something was off. The shadows were wrong. They moved differently, almost as if they had a life of their own. The corners of the room seemed darker, deeper. There was something, behind the shadows, something just out of reach. My eyes flicked around the room, searching for any sign of change. But then, I saw it. The window. It was wide open. I could have sworn I closed it earlier in the day, but there it was, standing open, the sheer curtains fluttering in the wind like a ghostly invitation. The cool air rushed in, biting at my skin, but it wasn't the coldness that sent a shiver down my spine. It was the feeling, the knowledge, that something had passed through that window. Something had come inside. I stood up abruptly, my heart hammering in my chest. My eyes scanned the room again, this time more frantically. The bed. The closet. The corners. It wasn't just the room that had changed. It was everything. The world outside was no longer familiar. My mind raced, unable to grasp what was happening. I felt like I had slipped into another dimension, one where nothing made sense, where the rules of reality didn't apply anymore. I needed to get out of this room. I needed to leave the house. I turned toward the door, but something stopped me. The sound, the scraping noise, the whispers had returned, but this time it was louder, more distinct. And it wasn't coming from outside the room. It was coming from inside the walls. I pressed my ear to the door, my breath shallow. The walls themselves were alive with the sound of movement. It was almost like the house was breathing, groaning with some hidden intent, its bones creaking and cracking as something shifted inside it. It was getting closer. I took a step back, my heart racing in my chest. The whispers, now in a language I couldn't understand, had become a chorus of sound swirling around me, filling the room. It was as if the house had come alive, feeding off my fear, feeding off the terror that was building inside me. And then, the real terror came. The floorboards began to creak. At first, it was a faint sound, barely perceptible, but it grew louder. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving toward me from the corner of the room. I froze. I had to make a choice. I turned to Emma, my eyes wild with panic. I shook her gently, trying to wake her, but she remained still, her breathing slow and steady. I could feel the coldness creeping over me, suffocating me. The footsteps were getting closer, and I knew, with a terrible certainty, that whatever was making them wasn't human. I didn't know how much time had passed, or if it even mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered now was getting out. I grabbed Emma by the shoulders, shaking her harder, my voice trembling with fear. Emma, wake up. We have to leave. Now. But her body was cold. I jerked back, a gasp escaping my lips. Her skin was unnaturally pale, her lips tinged with a faint blue. She didn't stir. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I felt a sharp coldness grip my chest. The whispers, once faint, now filled the room, their voices so close I could feel their breath on my skin. I couldn't hear them anymore. I couldn't understand them. But I felt them. The darkness seemed to be swallowing the room whole, the shadows pushing out the light, filling every inch of space. And then, as I backed away in terror, I saw something move in the corner of the room. It wasn't Emma. It wasn't human. It was alive. The porcelain figures, the ones on the mantel, were standing at the foot of the bed. And they were moving toward me. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt frozen, as though every inhalation was a struggle, fighting against the suffocating air that pressed on me from all directions. The room was darker now, darker than it had been moments before, as if the shadows had thickened, become more tangible, more real. And they were moving. The porcelain figures were no longer standing motionless at the foot of the bed. They were alive. I could barely comprehend it. It didn't make sense. Porcelain couldn't move. Dolls couldn't walk. But there they were, slowly, deliberately, gliding toward me. The pumpkin-headed figure, the skeleton, the witch. The same ones that had been on the mantel just a few moments ago. Their eyes, those dead, unblinking eyes, were locked on me. I staggered back, my mind reeling, unable to process what I was seeing. Every step they took was so unnervingly slow, the scraping of porcelain against the wooden floor like nails on a chalkboard, and the sound, oh, that sound, it filled the room, growing louder with every passing second. The air itself seemed to tremble with the weight of their movement. The pumpkin-headed figure was in the lead, its smile twisted and unnerving, like it was taunting me, mocking my fear. I couldn't look away. It was impossible to look away. As it came closer, I saw the intricate details of its face, the cracks in its porcelain skin, the faded paint that was peeling off. But it wasn't just the pumpkin I noticed. It was the eyes. Those hollow, black eyes. They weren't just watching me. They were hungry. The skeleton followed, its bony arms reaching out, its fingers long and skeletal, like they were stretching for something just beyond my reach. Its mouth opened wide, letting out a low, guttering sound, almost like a laugh, but empty, hollow, filled with something darker than any laughter could ever be. Its bones rattled with every movement, each sound more unsettling than the last. The witch's figure moved next, her crooked body swaying slightly as though carried by an invisible wind. Her gnarled fingers twitched, and the faintest glow seemed to pulse from within her, an eerie light coming from her eyes and mouth. There was something wrong about her. She wasn't just made of porcelain. I could feel her malice, her dark presence, creeping through the air toward me, chilling my very soul. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest, panic tightening its grip around me. I wanted to scream, but my throat had gone dry. I couldn't even move properly. I was frozen in place, rooted to the spot by the weight of the terror that filled the room. The house felt like it was closing in, the walls shifting, warping, as if they were alive too. And then, I heard it again. The whisper. This time, it was louder. clearer. It was coming from the figurines. The same whisper I had heard earlier, soft, insistent, unintelligible. But now, I could almost make out the words. I could almost feel them pressing against my skin, crawling under my flesh. Come closer, it seemed to say. You belong here. I shook my head violently, trying to clear the fog of fear that clouded my thoughts. I had to escape. I had to run. But my body felt heavy, sluggish. My feet felt like lead. The figurines were getting closer, their hollow eyes never leaving mine, their movements so slow, so deliberate, it was as if they were savoring every moment of my terror. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my hands trembling uncontrollably. My chest constricted, making it harder to breathe with every passing second. Every instinct told me to run, to escape this nightmare that was unfolding around me, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. It was as if something invisible was holding me in place, something dark and heavy, pressing down on my chest, suffocating me with its weight. Then, the room shifted. The walls seemed to bend, stretch, as if the room itself was warping around me. I could see the corners of the room closing in, getting smaller, tighter. The air was thick with the scent of dust, of old things, and something else. Something foul. Something rotting. I could feel the temperature dropping, the chill of death creeping into my bones. I turned toward the door again, my gaze desperately searching for an escape. But it was no use. The room wasn't right. The door was no longer where it had been. It was on the other side of the room now, but when I looked again, it had disappeared completely. The hallway was gone. The house itself was shifting, changing, turning into something else entirely. And then, I heard a low, rumbling sound, like the growl of something beneath the floorboards. The scraping noise intensified, louder now, and I could feel the vibrations under my feet, like the very foundation of the house was shaking. The figurines were closing in. They were too close now. They were so close I could almost feel their cold breath on my skin. The pumpkin-headed figure was only a few feet away now, its cracked face twisted into a smile, its hollow eyes gleaming with a sickening satisfaction. I had to move. I couldn't stand there any longer. I turned, my feet stumbling beneath me, and I lunged toward the window. I didn't care about the fall. I didn't care about anything. I just needed to get out of this house. This place was no longer a home. It was a prison. I grabbed the window latch with trembling hands and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked harder, desperate, my nails digging into the wood, but it was stuck. The window had become part of the wall. I could feel the oppressive weight of the house pressing in on me, suffocating me, trying to keep me here. And then I heard it. A voice. Not from the figurines, not from the whispers, but from within me. It's too late. The voice was cold, hollow, distant, but unmistakable. I looked around frantically, but there was no one there. No one to see. No one to save me. The walls of the room were closing in on me now, moving so fast I could hear them creaking, groaning under the pressure. The air was thick, suffocating. The whispers were all around me now, coming from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. I was trapped. The figurines had stopped moving. They were standing perfectly still now, watching me with their empty, soulless eyes. But something had changed. I felt their gaze pierce through me, like they were no longer just watching. They were waiting for me to become one of them. And then, everything went silent. For a moment, Just a single, terrible moment. There was nothing. No whispers. No scraping. No movement. Just the sound of my own ragged breath. And then, the pumpkin-headed figure smiled. And it wasn't a smile of porcelain anymore. It was something else. Something far darker. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room had thickened, as though it had become something solid, something suffocating. The figurine stood perfectly still, frozen in place as though the very world had held its breath with me. The pumpkin-headed figure, its cracked porcelain face twisted into that unnerving, unnatural smile, seemed to loom larger now, despite the fact that nothing had changed in size. It wasn't just watching me anymore, it was feeling me. Hunting me. The silence pressed in, unbearable and suffocating, broken only by the rapid beat of my heart. The room felt cold now, colder than it ever had, colder than it should have been in the middle of the night. The temperature plummeted so quickly that I could see my breath hanging in the air, a visible mist of terror escaping my mouth. I wanted to scream. I wanted to yell for Emma, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, the fear strangling me, knotting itself around my vocal cords. I wanted to turn, to run, to escape this nightmare, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped, rooted in place by an invisible force, held captive by something I could not see, only feel. And then, the whispers returned. Soft at first, like a breeze stirring the dead leaves outside, but then louder, more insistent, weaving around me, pressing into my skull like 1,000 voices begging to be heard. I couldn't understand them. I didn't want to understand them. But the closer the whispers came, the more I felt them digging into my mind, crawling through my thoughts like insects, making me feel, making me understand something awful, something unfathomable. You are one of us now. The voice was no longer distant, no longer disembodied. It was inside me. The figurines had stopped smiling. They had stopped moving. But I could feel their presence, like a weight pressing on my chest. Each breath felt like it would be my last. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not just by them, but by the house itself, as though the walls and floors had eyes, as though this entire place was alive with hunger. My mind spiraled, and the floor beneath my feet seemed to sway, like the house was rocking gently, as though it had somehow become a ship in a storm, ready to capsize. The weight of everything, this place, the horror, the isolation, pressed down on me. I could feel the slow creep of madness threatening to overtake my thoughts. But I had to focus. I had to survive. I had to get out. I stumbled toward the door again, desperate to escape this nightmare, but as I reached for the handle, I realized, with a sickening certainty, that it was no longer there. The door had vanished. It was as though the house itself had swallowed it whole, hiding it from me, trapping me inside. Panic surged through me. I turned back to the room, to the figures that had once been so still, so lifeless. They were moving again, but not in the way they had before. They weren't walking. They were shifting, growing, swelling. The porcelain bodies were warping, contorting, as if the figures were trying to break free from their rigid shells, stretching and bending into grotesque shapes. I felt my legs give way beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor, my hands splayed out against the cold wood, trembling uncontrollably. The room spun. My thoughts swirled like a storm, each one crashing into the next, faster and faster, until I couldn't hold on to anything anymore. The walls pulsed in time with my heartbeat, the floor creaked, groaned, as though it was alive, breathing. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I saw something. Something that stopped my heart dead in my chest. Emma. She was standing in the doorway. Her eyes were wide, her face pale as death. Her lips were parted as though she were about to speak, but no sound came. Her skin was wrong. It was too pale, too still. She looked hollow, like she had been drained of everything that made her human. I screamed her name, but the sound that came out was a hoarse rasp, barely more than a whisper. I pushed myself to my feet, trying to run to her, to grab her, to pull her away from whatever had done this to her. But my feet were heavy, my body weak, and I stumbled toward her like a man drowning in quicksand. "Emma, please." I gasped, but she didn't respond. She didn't even blink. She just stood there, watching me with those wide, glassy eyes. There was no recognition in them. No love. No warmth. Just an empty, hollow stare. The figurines had stopped moving, their eyes fixed on Emma now. I could feel the weight of their gaze on me as well, but they were focused on her. And in that moment, I knew what they wanted. They didn't care about me anymore. They wanted her. But something else had changed. The whispers had intensified, becoming frantic now, like a chorus of voices all screaming at once. It was deafening. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder, sharper, until it felt like it was cutting into my skin, tearing through my thoughts. And then there was a shift. The house shifted. The floor beneath me cracked open with a sickening sound. The walls twisted and warped, their angles stretching unnaturally. The air became thick, heavy with an otherworldly presence, something older, more ancient than anything I could comprehend. The very foundation of the house groaned and screamed as though it was being ripped apart from the inside out. And at that moment, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. The house was alive. It had always been alive, and it had always been watching, waiting for me. I stumbled backward, my eyes locked on Emma, who was still standing motionless in the doorway. The pumpkin-headed figure, the skeleton, the witch, they were closing in on her now, moving with unnatural speed, their porcelain faces twisted in grotesque expressions. I reached for her, my voice cracking, desperate. "Emma, run. Please, run." But she didn't move. I reached out again, my hand trembling, but before I could touch her, the floor split open completely, and a wave of cold, damp air rushed out of the dark void beneath. The figurines were no longer on the floor. They were above me, surrounding me. Their eyes were glowing now, a sickly, unnatural light emanating from within the cracks of their porcelain faces. And then everything went black. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was Emma's face, her hollow, lifeless eyes staring back at me. I reached out to her one last time, but there was nothing left to hold on to. The house had claimed us both, and there was no escape. Have you ever felt like something was following you, even when you were alone? I don't mean the usual feeling of being watched. No, this was different. It wasn't a vague sensation, this was the overwhelming certainty that something, or someone, was out there, copying your every move, just waiting for the right moment to strike. That was the feeling that hit me when I first stepped into the canyon. It was supposed to be a peaceful hike, just me in the canyon, with nothing but the whisper of the wind and the crunch of gravel under my boots. Utah's deserts are beautiful in a way that feels almost sacred, as if the land itself is holding its breath, waiting for someone to notice the way the red rock cliffs catch the light at dawn, or how the shadows stretch long into the afternoon. But this place? This canyon? It wasn't like the rest. It wasn't like the peaceful solitude I'd hoped for. The moment I stepped in, there was something off. I couldn't explain it, not at first. It was just a faint sense of unease, a shadow in my mind that I couldn't push away. Maybe it was the wind rattling the leaves in the distance, or the way the sun seemed to disappear behind the jagged cliffs faster than it should have, casting the path into darkness. But then I heard it. A faint rustling behind me. At first, I thought it was an animal, some small creature darting across the ground or a bird flapping its wings, but when I stopped and turned to look, there was nothing. No movement. Just the whisper of wind in the canyon. I shook my head. It was nothing. The silence of the canyon was getting to me. That's all. I kept walking, the path narrowing as the canyon walls rose higher on either side of me. The sound of my boots crunching on the gravel was the only thing I could focus on. The longer I walked, though, the more the feeling of being watched crept back in. It wasn't just a presence I felt anymore, it was a reflection. A sensation that when I took a step, something took one just after me. A chill ran through me, and I quickened my pace. My breath came a little faster now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. I reached a bend in the canyon. The walls were steep now, forming a narrow gap where the sun barely touched the ground. I paused for a moment, looking out over the rugged terrain, trying to shake the nagging feeling in my gut. But then, I saw something, a dark shape on the edge of my vision. It was a shadow, stretching unnaturally long across the canyon floor. I stopped. The wind had died down, and the air was still. Too still. The shadow moved again, and I froze, unable to look away. It wasn't a natural shadow. It didn't belong to anything. The sun was high in the sky, casting everything in sharp, clean light. But this shadow, it wasn't cast by me, nor by anything around me. It just was. And it was moving, mimicking my every step, just a fraction slower, a fraction more exaggerated. I blinked. The shadow stretched further, its outline growing more defined, more alive. I didn't understand. Shadows didn't move like that. I took a step forward, and the shadow followed. But it didn't just follow, it waited. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped back, and the shadow did the same, but this time it was faster. And then it stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound. No movement. Just the suffocating stillness of the canyon pressing in from all sides. What was this? I took another step forward, and the shadow, now growing larger, seemed to swell and ripple, as though it were expanding in reaction to my every movement. My stomach tightened with a cold dread. It was as though the shadow was mirroring me, copying everything I did, but with a sickening, unnatural delay. My pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. I felt it deep in my bones. I turned and started walking faster, my boots slapping against the gravel, but the shadow didn't slow down. In fact, it seemed to pick up speed, stretching and shifting faster than I could move. I felt the sweat beginning to bead on my forehead, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, a creeping sensation crawling up my spine. I glanced over my shoulder again. It was closer now. The shadow was longer, more distorted. And then I saw it, a shape just at the edge of the shadow, like a person, but not quite. The outline was all wrong, a grotesque twist of limbs that stretched out unnaturally, following my every movement with a predatory grace. I turned around completely, heart hammering in my chest, and broke into a run. The shadow seemed to respond in kind. It was faster now, too fast. It was right behind me. Every step I took, it was there, closer, its presence looming in my peripheral vision. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel it, like the air was thickening, the temperature dropping, the canyon walls closing in on me. I ran faster, my lungs burning, but the shadow was still there. It was growing, stretching, changing. It wasn't just following anymore, it was hunting. The walls of the canyon were closing, and now the path was narrowing, and I felt panic begin to rise in my chest. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. I glanced behind me once more, and the shadow, that thing, was closer, its outline jagged, like a dark, monstrous copy of myself. I could hear its echoing footsteps now, too, no longer a faint rustle, but the unmistakable sound of something following. Something that was moving faster than I ever could. I wasn't alone, but I wasn't sure what it wanted, and I didn't know how to stop it. I couldn't breathe. Every step felt heavier, the weight of my panic pressing down on my chest, making it harder to inhale. My heart was hammering in my ears. I was running blindly now, my feet stumbling over loose stones, my body pulled by instinct I couldn't control. The canyon walls seemed to grow higher with every turn, narrowing into a claustrophobic passage that threatened to suffocate me. But still, I ran. I dared not look back again. I already knew the shadow was there, its unnatural, jagged outline burning itself into my mind, moving faster with each step I took. It wasn't just following me anymore, it was matching me. Every time I picked up the pace, it did too, a dark, monstrous echo of my every movement, a twisted imitation that haunted my every glance. I had to get out. I had to find a way to escape this thing, but there was nowhere to go. The canyon was a labyrinth, a vast network of rocky corridors that twisted and turned in all directions. Each path led to another narrow passage, another dead end, another place where I could feel the shadows stalking me, looming ever closer. The air was thick now, heavier with each breath, like the very atmosphere of the canyon had become charged with some unseen force. My feet were pounding, my lungs were burning, but the shadow was closer than ever. I could feel it pressing in on me from behind. The echo of my own steps had become distorted, stretched out, as if the ground itself was warping beneath me. The sound of my breathing felt wrong, too sharp, too fast, as though it was being mirrored by something else. A thought hit me like a punch to the gut. The shadow wasn't just mimicking my movements. It was learning. It was adapting to me, becoming faster, more precise, like it was anticipating my next move, predicting where I would go. I forced myself to push harder, my legs shaking from the effort, but with every burst of speed, the shadow grew faster. It had to be right behind me now, just inches away. I could feel the darkness creeping at the edge of my vision, stretching out like fingers that were ready to seize me. Then, I heard it. The sound wasn't just my footsteps. It was something deeper, more resonant, like a low, guttural growl. My spine straightened. The growl wasn't mine. It was coming from the shadow. I turned my head quickly, desperate to see what was chasing me. But when I looked back, all I saw was a blur of darkness, a mass of shifting, writhing shapes that were too monstrous to comprehend. It wasn't a simple shadow anymore. It was alive. It was as though the very darkness of the canyon had taken form, manifesting as something twisted, something that shouldn't exist. I saw flashes of limbs, of a head too large, of features that didn't belong to any living thing. The growl grew louder, more menacing. A primal, animalistic sound that sent a chill through my veins. I stumbled, my foot catching on a loose rock, and I fell to the ground, hitting the canyon floor hard. Pain shot up my side, but I didn't have time to focus on it. I had to get up, now. I scrambled to my feet, but when I turned to look back again, the shadow was closer than I had ever imagined. Its form was more defined now, more monstrous. It was no longer just mimicking me, it was filling the canyon, stretching across the path like a dark wave, its form shifting and warping with every step it took, growing larger, more distorted. I could hear the whisper of its movements, the way it slid across the rocks, faster than I could ever move. It was closing in. I ran again, blindly this time, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite grasp. I had to find somewhere to hide, some way to escape. But there was no hiding from this. The very canyon felt alive, as though the rocks themselves were closing in, shifting and changing, trapping me in a never-ending chase. The growl was growing louder, now mixed with a rasping sound, like something heavy dragging against the stone. The shadow, it was no longer a shadow, it was a thing that was following me, hunting me. I couldn't outrun it, couldn't outpace it. I was running on pure instinct now, fear coursing through my veins, pushing me forward even when my body screamed for me to stop. And then, there it was. A narrow ledge, a small shelf of rock jutting out from the canyon wall. I had no choice. I had to climb it. I pushed myself toward it, the distance closing with agonizing slowness. The shadow was so close now. I could feel its presence wrapping around me, pressing on all sides. With a desperate surge of strength, I launched myself toward the ledge, my hands scraping against the stone, my fingers sliding over the rough surface. I caught the edge, my fingertips digging into the cracks, and with everything I had left, I hauled myself up onto the ledge. I didn't stop. I crawled forward, my breath ragged and shallow, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear. I looked down once, but all I saw was the massive shadow below, stretching out to fill the space beneath me, its shape warping, reaching, grasping. I couldn't stay here forever. The ledge was narrow, and the shadow was relentless. It wasn't just mimicking me anymore. It was learning, evolving. It would find me. My mind raced. The only way out was further into the canyon, deeper into the maze of rocks. There had to be something. Somewhere. Some way to escape. But I couldn't shake the feeling it was always one step ahead. And every step I took, it was right behind me. I had no choice. I had to keep moving. I had to keep running. I don't know how long I had been running at that point. Minutes? Hours? Time had become a blur. Every second felt like an eternity, and yet, the only thing that kept me moving forward was the pounding of my heart and the unyielding sense that the shadow was still there, still chasing me. I couldn't outrun it. I knew that now. No matter how fast I moved, no matter how many twists and turns I made in the canyon, it was always a few steps behind, waiting for the right moment to catch up. The silence around me was deafening, except for the sound of my own desperate breathing. The growl of the shadow had stopped, but I could still feel its presence in every crack of the canyon, in every shadow that stretched unnaturally. I was starting to doubt myself. Was this real? Was this some trick of the mind? But when I turned around again, when I saw it, when I felt it, the truth of the thing was undeniable. The shadow was real. It was alive. It was hunting me. I stumbled again, my legs burning from exhaustion, my feet slipping over the uneven terrain. The narrow ledge I had climbed had only taken me a short way up, but now I was back on the canyon floor, my only choice to push deeper into the heart of this desolate place. I had no other options. The shadow was closing in. Every time I glanced back, it was closer, its shape becoming clearer, more defined. The dark form was a grotesque mockery of me, a twisted version of my own movements. It was too fast, too silent, too unnatural. But then, ahead of me, something caught my eye. A break in the canyon wall, a wide crevice between two towering rocks. It looked like a path, one that led deeper into the canyon, further into the heart of the desert. It wasn't much, but it was something that could offer a brief respite, a chance to gain some distance. I pushed forward toward it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my eyes scanning the walls around me. The path seemed to narrow the further I went, the air growing warmer, heavier, the sunlight barely making it through the tight squeeze between the rocks. The shadows around me deepened, stretching as if reaching for me, but I forced myself to keep going, determined not to be consumed by the suffocating darkness behind me. As I entered the narrow gap, I could hear the faintest echo of movement, the sound of something following me. The air was thick with dust, and the walls of the canyon pressed in on either side, like the jaws of some ancient beast waiting to snap shut. My mind raced. Was I being led into a trap? Had the shadow already planned my path? I couldn't think about that now. I had to focus on surviving. I had to keep moving. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted, and I slipped, falling forward into a deeper, darker crevice. My arms flailed as I tried to catch myself, but there was nothing to grab onto. I crashed into the ground with a sharp thud, pain lancing through my side as I landed awkwardly. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, my mind scrambling to make sense of the situation. The fall had disoriented me, but I forced myself to sit up. The darkness around me was absolute now. I couldn't see anything but the faint outline of the rocks above me, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and earth. I didn't know how deep I had fallen, but I couldn't stay down here. I had to get up. I reached out, my hands brushing against the rough surface of the canyon floor, trying to find my bearings. I knew I had to keep moving, but there was a feeling in the pit of my stomach that told me this was exactly what the shadow wanted. It had been waiting for me to make a mistake, to slip, to fall into a place where it could trap me. But I couldn't let it. I wouldn't let it win. I pushed myself up, stumbling to my feet, and that's when I heard it again. A soft, wet sound, like something breathing heavily just beyond my reach. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I had to look. I turned slowly, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The walls of the canyon were close, too close. I could barely make out the details of the rock, the jagged edges looming like teeth, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, silhouetted against the faint light. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the mind, some illusion created by the darkness and my fear. But no! It wasn't. It was real. The shadow stood there, unmoving, just at the edge of my vision. It was too tall, too large, its shape too distorted. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me, waiting, as if it was savoring the moment. I took a step back, but it didn't follow. It just waited, like it was trying to figure me out. The longer I stared at it, the more I realized that this thing wasn't a shadow at all. It was something more. Something ancient. Something that had been here long before me, and would remain long after I was gone. I turned and ran again, my footsteps echoing in the narrow crevice. The walls pressed in closer, the path becoming more treacherous with each step. My mind raced with fear, but there was something else too, a strange, gnawing feeling that I was heading towards something. Something at the center of this canyon. Something that I couldn't see yet, but that I could feel like a pulse beneath the earth. The shadow followed, of course. It always followed. But now it was more than just a pursuit. It was a force. A presence that had a purpose. And I was part of it. I didn't know how I knew it, but I felt it deep in my soul. The heart of the canyon wasn't just a place. It was a trap. And it was pulling me closer. The air was thick now, oppressive, pressing down on me like an invisible hand. Each breath was harder to take as the walls of the canyon seemed to narrow around me, constricting until I could barely move. Every step I took felt heavier, as if the ground itself was trying to pull me down into its depths. My legs were weak from running, my body aching, but there was no stopping now. The shadow was still behind me, closer than ever. The path was treacherous. Loose stones slid beneath my feet, and sharp rocks jutted up from the walls, making it harder to keep my balance. Every now and then, I'd hear the faintest scrape or echo, like the shadow was brushing against the rocks, adapting, learning, just as it had before. It was becoming more relentless, more predatory with each step, as if it knew what I was thinking before I even had the chance to react. The silence around me was maddening. There were no birds here, no sound of wind, no signs of life. The canyon felt abandoned, a hollowed-out tomb where only the dead wandered. The weight of the silence pressed on my chest, suffocating me, making my heart pound louder in my ears. Every now and then, I thought I could hear the whisper of something deep, something primal, but when I stopped to listen, it would fade, leaving only the oppressive stillness. I didn't know where I was heading anymore. The path had become a maze, a labyrinth of jagged stone and darkness. Every turn felt like a trap, every narrowing of the canyon walls like a noose tightening around me. The sense of being watched, of being followed, was overwhelming. I felt it in my bones. The shadow was there, lurking just beyond the reach of my eyes, its presence seeping into every crack of the canyon. I had to find a way out. But the further I went, the more I realized that there was no escape. The canyon had become a living thing, a place that bent and twisted according to its own will. The walls seemed to shift as I moved through them, closing in behind me, as if the very landscape itself was trying to trap me. I felt my sanity beginning to fray, my thoughts becoming disjointed, my mind struggling to keep up with the horrors unfolding around me. The shadow, that grotesque reflection of myself, was no longer just following me. It was pursuing me, closing in like a predator savoring its prey. I couldn't keep running. Not like this. I pressed my back against the canyon wall, trying to catch my breath, trying to steady my thoughts. The air felt thick and stagnant, the scent of dust and earth heavy in my nostrils. My hands trembled as I wiped the sweat from my forehead. The sun was still high above, but the narrowness of the canyon kept most of the light away. I was enveloped in shadow now, but it wasn't the shadow of the rocks, it was something else, something darker, more sinister. Then, I saw it. A flicker of movement, just ahead. A shape. I froze, my blood running cold. It was the shadow, but not in the way I had seen it before. It was here, right in front of me. The dark figure was looming in the distance, its form distorted and almost unrecognizable, as if it were trying to take on my shape but couldn't quite manage it. It was growing larger by the second, its edges becoming sharper, more defined. The whisper of its movements grew louder, the scratching sound against the rocks as it dragged itself closer. I was trapped. The walls of the canyon closed in around me, the passage narrowing until there was no way to go forward. I had nowhere to run. I spun around, desperately searching for an exit, but every path I saw only led deeper into the darkness. The shadow was pressing in, creeping toward me, and the silence was deafening. My breath quickened, my heart racing, as I realized there was no escape. This was it. I was going to die here. No. I couldn't accept that. I refused to. I couldn't outrun it, but maybe I could fight it. I turned, my hands shaking as I fumbled for something, anything, to defend myself. The ground was littered with jagged stones, sharp rocks jutting out from the earth. I grabbed one, feeling the cool, rough texture of it in my hand. It was heavy, the perfect size to hold in my fist. My mind raced. I had no idea how to fight a shadow, no idea how to stop something that moved so fast, so relentlessly. But I wasn't going down without a fight. I turned to face it, my body tense, every nerve on fire. The shadow was getting closer now, its shape no longer just an outline but a grotesque, shifting form that seemed to pulsate with malevolent energy. I could hear the sound of its breath, low and ragged, growing louder with each passing second. I raised the rock, gripping it tightly. The shadow paused, as if it had heard my movement, as if it knew what I was planning. For a moment, everything was still. My heart pounded in my ears, the silence unbearable. And then it lunged. It moved faster than I could react. The shadow shot forward with a speed that defied logic, closing the gap between us in an instant. I swung the rock, aiming for the shifting form, but it passed right through the darkness as if it didn't exist. The shadow twisted and stretched, forming into something larger, more monstrous, something that was not just a reflection of me but something other, something wrong. I staggered back, the weight of fear settling in my chest. The rock fell from my hand, useless against the creature before me. My breath caught in my throat. I had no idea how to stop this. The shadow was more than just an apparition, it was a force, a presence that had lived here long before I had arrived, and it wasn't going to stop until it consumed me. The canyon, the walls, the very ground beneath my feet seemed to shift once again, as if it were bending to the will of the thing that had followed me here. The landscape was no longer just a maze, it was a prison, and I was the one it was meant to trap. I could hear the shadow's voice now. A low, guttural sound, not with words, but with a feeling, a pulse that seemed to beat in my chest. It was closing in, its form undulating like smoke, slipping through the cracks, creeping through the narrowest spaces. There was no escape. I wasn't just being haunted. I was being consumed. And the worst part? I was beginning to realize I wasn't sure if I ever would leave this canyon. The longer I stayed, the more it felt like the very land was absorbing me, pulling me deeper into its grip. It was part of me now, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The air was heavy, suffocating. I couldn't breathe, not fully, not properly. My lungs were tight, as though the very atmosphere was pushing down on me, forcing the air from my chest. Panic clawed at my throat, but I had no time to indulge in it. The shadow was here, just inches away from me, its form shifting, stretching, and pulsing with a dark energy that seemed to drain the very light around it. I backed up slowly, feeling the rough, jagged wall of the canyon scrape against my shoulders. Every inch of space behind me felt smaller, more claustrophobic. There was no room to run, no place to hide. The canyon walls, once towering and majestic, had become an endless maze, a trap with no way out. Every path I took, every turn I made, seemed to bring me right back here, right back to the heart of the darkness that had been pursuing me since the moment I set foot in this cursed place. The shadow, no, the thing, was no longer merely a reflection of me. It had taken on a life of its own, an entity that seemed to bend reality around it. The way it moved, its fluidity, was unnatural. It stretched and contorted, twisting and curling like smoke until I couldn't tell where it began or where it ended. Its edges were sharp, jagged, as though it existed in a state of perpetual flux, always on the verge of changing, always too much to grasp. But what terrified me more than its shape, more than its presence, was its knowledge. It knew me. It knew my thoughts, my fears, my very soul. The longer I stared at it, the more I could feel it inside me, like a splinter lodged deep in my mind, sending tremors through every thought I had. It was as though it was feeding off my fear, feeding off the panic that I couldn't control, growing stronger with each passing second. I couldn't make out its face. If it had one, it was hidden beneath the shifting darkness. But there was something in its form, in the way it mimicked my every movement, that made my skin crawl. It was as though it wasn't just following me, it was becoming me. And the more I saw of it, the more I realized it was not some strange trick of light or shadow. It was real. And it wanted me. I thought I heard something. A whisper, maybe. Or was it the sound of my own breathing, ragged and fast, echoing in the narrow canyon? I wasn't sure anymore. The line between reality and the nightmare I was trapped in had begun to blur. I took a step back, trying to stay calm, trying to find some logical explanation for what was happening. But no logic could explain this. There was no way to reason with the impossible. I turned, desperate to find a way out, a gap in the canyon's walls that might offer me a chance to flee. But the walls were smooth, their surface unyielding, mocking me with every attempt. The shadow was still there, right at my heels, just a breath away. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it again, the flicker of movement. A shape, indistinct at first, but there, shifting in the corner of my vision. I whipped my head around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing. Only the oppressive darkness of the canyon, the feeling of being surrounded by something I couldn't understand, couldn't fight. I started running again, pushing myself harder than before. My body screamed for rest, but I ignored it, my feet slipping and sliding on the uneven terrain. I didn't care anymore. The fear had taken over, my instincts driving me forward. But as I ran, I realized that I wasn't making any progress. The walls of the canyon, which had once felt like a towering fortress, now felt like they were closing in on me, shrinking with every step I took. The shadow was faster than I was. I knew that now. It didn't just mimic my movements, it anticipated them. Every time I moved, it moved. Every time I looked, it was already there, waiting for me to make a mistake. And no matter how hard I tried, no matter how quickly I ran, it was always there. Always just behind me. I stumbled, my foot catching on a rock, and I fell to the ground with a crash. My hand scraped against the rough stone, my skin torn and raw. I barely had time to push myself up before I heard the unmistakable sound of something moving. A soft rustling, like wind against dry leaves, but more deliberate, more alive. I turned, my body trembling, and saw it. It was standing there, just beyond my reach, its shape now more defined than ever. It loomed in the darkness, an uncanny, twisted reflection of me. Its form was distorted, monstrous, its eyes, if it even had eyes, shone with an otherworldly gleam, reflecting the dim light of the canyon. Its limbs were long, unnaturally elongated, and as it moved closer, I could see its fingers stretching, reaching for me. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I could feel its presence in my mind now, pushing against the edges of my sanity, making it hard to think, to breathe. It was everywhere, inside me, around me, and I couldn't escape. There was nowhere left to run. I backed up against the canyon wall, my chest heaving, my mind racing. I had to do something. I had to fight, even if I didn't know how. But as I stood there, frozen in terror, the shadow reached out. It wasn't a hand, not exactly. More like an extension of itself, an ethereal limb, a mass of darkness that wrapped around me, pulling me in. It wasn't touching me, not physically, but I could feel it, its coldness, its weight. It was like the very essence of it was suffocating me. I gasped, unable to move, my body unwilling to obey. I was trapped in the grip of the shadow, unable to break free. The darkness was consuming me, wrapping around me like a shroud, and I knew, with a terrible certainty, that this was how it would end. The shadow was swallowing me whole. And then, just as I thought I couldn't breathe anymore, the world tilted, and I was falling. Down. Deep into the earth. The ground beneath me gave way, and I tumbled, spiraling into nothingness. I reached out, my arms flailing, but there was nothing to grab. The darkness swallowed me whole, and I let out one final scream as I fell into the abyss. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't just trapped in the canyon anymore. I was part of it now. Forever. Have you ever felt something watching you, but when you turned around, there was nothing there? I live in a small, run-down apartment building in the heart of Chicago. The kind of place where the paint peels off the walls and the air smells faintly of mildew and old carpet. The halls are narrow, the light flickering at times, and the creaking of the floors echoes like whispers of the past. You get used to it, or at least, that's what I thought. It started, at first, as something I thought was just my imagination. The hallway between the stairs was always dim, with the flickering bulb overhead casting long, spindly shadows along the walls. It wasn't a big space, just a short stretch with 3 floors stacked above and below, but there was something strange about it. One night, around midnight, I noticed them. The eyes. They weren't like the typical shadows cast by the light. They were alive, glowing faintly, like 2 small orbs of light hovering just above the last step of the stairwell. For a moment, I thought maybe it was some strange reflection, but I had seen it too many times now to dismiss it. It wasn't a trick of the light, it wasn't a fluke. Each time I would pass by, the eyes seemed to follow me. They didn't blink. They didn't move. Just 2 glowing orbs, suspended in the darkness. At first, I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a cat that had made its home somewhere in the building. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, there was something about the stillness, the unnatural quality to those eyes, that unsettled me. I wasn't the only one who had seen them. One of my neighbors, Carlos, mentioned them too when we bumped into each other by the mailboxes. "You seen those eyes in the stairwell?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual, even though my heart was pounding in my chest. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. Carlos didn't look convinced. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the dimly lit hallway. "I've heard things too. Late at night, when it's real quiet. Sometimes I hear steps, but no one's there." His words made the hairs on my neck stand up. I wanted to ask more, but I couldn't bring myself to. The silence that followed was heavy, as if we were both afraid of voicing too much. That night, the glow seemed brighter, more intense than usual. As I walked past the stairs, I could feel my pulse quicken. The building was silent, the usual hum of the city outside muffled by the thick brick walls. I glanced at the stairs, trying to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. The eyes were there again, just as they always were. I paused, and that's when it happened. The eyes shifted. At least, that's what I thought at first. It was so subtle, I couldn't be sure if I had imagined it, but the light had changed. The glow seemed a bit brighter, as though they were drawing closer, or maybe waiting. I blinked, trying to dismiss the thought. But when I turned to leave, my foot caught on the edge of the step, and I stumbled forward, my heart leaping into my throat. I caught myself just in time, but when I looked back up, the eyes were no longer where they had been. They were higher now, closer. I froze. My breath hitched in my chest, a wave of panic spreading through me. The hairs on my arms prickled, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. My mind raced. Was it possible that something was actually there, something alive? It was ridiculous, right? I must have been overtired. I mean, it was a long day, and the building was old. There were probably mice or some other animals in the walls. But still, my feet didn't want to move. I wanted to get away, but I couldn't tear my eyes from the stairwell. My legs felt heavy, as though the very air in the hallway was thickening, pressing in on me. I shook my head, forcing myself to take a step back. But as I turned to walk away, I heard something. A soft scraping sound, like nails against wood. I froze. I was sure it was coming from the stairs, just above the landing. I slowly turned around, hoping to see nothing, just the empty space of the hallway. But as I slowly glanced upward, the eyes were back. This time, they were closer. Much closer. They were staring straight at me. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my body refusing to obey, my mind screaming for me to run, but the rest of me just froze. The air grew thicker, as though the space itself was tightening around me, suffocating me. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, each thump a frantic drumbeat in the silence of the hallway. And then, just as I thought I might break into a full-blown panic, the lights flickered. For a brief moment, everything was plunged into darkness. I felt my pulse spike, my chest tightening. The fear was overwhelming, but I told myself it was just a power surge. That's all it was. The lights blinked back on. But now, the eyes were gone. Just like that. I wasn't sure whether I was relieved or terrified. The emptiness of the hallway, the absolute silence, was somehow worse than the eyes. I turned and ran to my apartment, not daring to look back. But when I reached my door, I realized something. I wasn't the only one afraid of the dark anymore. And it wasn't just the eyes. It was what else might be hiding in the shadows. The next few days were a blur of unease. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, it's not like I had actually seen anything threatening, right? Just a pair of glowing eyes. But the sensation stuck with me, and I couldn't shake it off. Each time I passed the stairwell, I felt that knot in my stomach tighten, and every flicker of light in the hallway made my breath catch. I tried to act normal, get back to my routine. But it wasn't easy. The building felt different now. There was an unnatural stillness in the air. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The sounds that had always been familiar, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floors, now felt like they were too loud. like they were trying to drown out something I wasn't supposed to hear. I wasn't the only one who felt it. My neighbor, Carlos, had stopped speaking to me after our last brief conversation about the eyes. He seemed shaken, too. It was as though we were both living in the same building but had become strangers to each other. Avoiding eye contact, walking quickly down the halls, trying to ignore the sounds of scratching in the walls. The light in the hallway still flickered intermittently, casting long, crooked shadows that stretched across the walls. It was as if the building itself was sick, like it was quietly decaying, piece by piece, with the faintest whisper of something terrible underneath it all. That evening, I had to leave my apartment. The groceries needed to be restocked, and I couldn't keep putting it off. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt that all too familiar chill run down my spine. It was barely 9 p.m., and the building was already eerily quiet. The elevator creaked to a stop as I stepped inside, but for once, I didn't mind the isolation. There were fewer people to see, fewer chances of having to explain why my eyes were constantly darting to the stairwell. But when I reached the ground floor, I noticed something odd. The door to the stairwell was slightly ajar. Now, the stairwell door was always closed. That was one of the building's quirks. It didn't stay open. The hinges were old, and the door had a tendency to creak shut if left ajar, which, of course, most people had learned to avoid. Yet there it was, slightly open, an invitation to the darkness inside. I stopped. The air felt thick, suffocating. For a second, I wondered if I was just overreacting, if my mind had finally started playing tricks on me. But no! The door was open. The eyes were waiting. Without really thinking, I took a few steps closer, trying to quiet the rising panic in my chest. I peered inside the stairwell, the faint glow from the dim hallway light barely illuminating the concrete steps below. There was nothing there, of course. Just shadows. Shadows that were dancing unnaturally, stretching along the walls like they had a life of their own. I was about to pull away, to turn and head back toward the elevator, but then I heard it. A whisper. It was barely audible, like a faint rustle of paper or a breath drawn too quickly. But it was there. In the stillness of the hallway, it felt as though the very air was trembling with it. Leave. The word was sharp, clear in my head, though I couldn't tell where it had come from. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I couldn't see anyone. No one was there. I strained my ears, but the hallway was empty, as it always had been. Leave. Again, the whisper, this time closer. The words almost seemed to pull me in, to drag me deeper into the darkness of the stairwell. It was like the air itself was thick with the promise of something more. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. For a moment, I debated just leaving. Turning around, walking away, and never thinking about it again. But then I heard something else. The sound of footsteps. Soft, tentative, as if someone, or something, was moving up the stairs. I swallowed, my throat dry. My mind screamed at me to go back to my apartment, to lock the door, to call someone, anyone. But my legs wouldn't obey. My feet moved forward as if drawn by some invisible force, towards the open door, towards the thing that had been lurking there in the dark. I crept inside, trying not to make a sound, the smell of mildew heavy in the air. I could feel my pulse in my throat, every step an agonizing drumbeat. The only sound was the distant hum of the building's pipes, the occasional creak of the old stairs beneath my feet. And then I heard it again. The whisper. But this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, a faint, eerie murmur that seemed to bounce off the walls, reverberating around me. It sounded like hundreds of voices, layered on top of each other, speaking in unison, but the words were indistinguishable, blending into a dissonant hum that made my skin crawl. I wanted to turn back. I should have turned back. But something held me there. As I reached the first landing, I noticed a shadow. No, not a shadow. It was something moving. It darted out of my line of sight and then darted back, so fast that I barely caught a glimpse of it. A figure. No, not a figure. A blur, a flash of movement that didn't belong. A shiver ran through me as I took another step. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. A cold breath on the back of my neck, a sharp sensation of something brushing past me, something too quick to be real, too silent to be human. And then, the eyes. Two glowing orbs, just like before, but this time they were not at the top of the stairs. They were directly in front of me. And they were moving. Slowly, deliberately. I took a step back. Then another. My heart was in my throat now, beating faster than I thought possible. I knew what was coming. But my feet were stuck, my body paralyzed by a fear so intense it felt as though the air had turned to lead. The whispering voices grew louder. The eyes drew closer. And then, the light flickered once again. Everything went black. The darkness swallowed everything. It felt oppressive, as though the air had thickened and turned to something solid, something I couldn't escape. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, too loud, too frantic. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. The silence was suffocating. I tried to move, but my legs felt like they were made of stone, anchored to the cold floor. The flickering light had gone out completely, leaving me in a void. I couldn't see anything, nothing but the vague shapes of walls around me, the cold, concrete stairwell that seemed to stretch on forever. The glowing eyes, those cursed eyes, were gone. Or perhaps they had never been real at all, an illusion of my panicked mind. But the feeling remained. The awareness that something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake, to show weakness. I could feel it, pressing against my skin. My hands trembled as I reached for the wall, desperate for any point of contact that might help ground me. My fingers brushed against the rough, cold surface. It gave me a small sense of direction. At least I wasn't completely lost, not yet. I took a tentative step forward, but as soon as I did, the whispers returned. Faint at first, like a soft hum in the distance. But the moment I moved, they grew louder. It wasn't just a murmur anymore. The voices were close, too close, and they were saying something I couldn't understand. It was a jumbled mess, a blend of words that didn't make sense, a cacophony of confusion. Then I heard it. A footstep. It was faint, but it was there, shuffling, as if someone, or something, was dragging its feet across the floor. Slowly. Methodically. I froze. The sound was faint, but it was unmistakable. Whoever, or whatever, was in here with me was moving. The walls felt alive, pulsating with every footstep, as though the building itself was breathing, tightening around me, suffocating me. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry, the taste of fear thick on my tongue. My legs were still locked in place, but I forced them to move. Slowly at first, hesitant. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn and run. But something, some primal instinct, kept me going forward. One more step. Then another. I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, but I could feel them. The air was heavy, charged with an energy that I couldn't explain. It was as though something was shifting around me, something that wasn't bound by the same rules of reality I knew. It was here, it was close, and it wasn't going anywhere. I reached the next landing and stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the corner of the stairwell, I saw something moving. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light, this was something solid. Something alive. It was dark, darker than the surrounding shadows, and it moved in a way that didn't seem natural. I couldn't make out its shape at first. It was too fluid, too fast. But then, it stopped. For a moment, all was still. And then it came into focus. It was a figure. Or at least, it looked like one. But it wasn't quite right. Its edges were blurry, distorted, like it was existing on the fringes of reality itself. The shape shifted with every blink, every moment, as if it couldn't quite stay in one form. But the most disturbing thing was its eyes. They weren't just glowing, they were burning, searing through the darkness, tracking every movement I made. For a second, I thought I saw its mouth move, but no sound came from it. Just a deep, sickening silence. I tried to back away, but my feet refused to move. My heart was hammering in my chest, thundering against my ribs, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The figure didn't move, didn't advance, but I could feel it. It was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. And with every second that passed, I felt more and more like I was suffocating in its presence. Then the whispering started again. Only this time, it was different. This time, the words were clearer. Come closer. It wasn't a request. It was a command, a pull that seemed to reach inside of me and tug at something deep within my soul. I could feel it, the weight of it, the pressure pushing against my chest. Every part of me screamed to run, but my body remained still, locked in place by fear, by the overwhelming power of the presence in front of me. The figure shifted again, but this time it wasn't just the edges that blurred. Its whole form was warping, stretching unnaturally. It was getting bigger, taller, looming over me like a shadow, a dark and terrible presence that blocked out the very light itself. And then I heard the footsteps again. Closer this time. Leave, the voices whispered, louder now, rising in unison. Leave now. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to do anything to escape this suffocating nightmare. But I couldn't. The fear had taken hold of me, paralyzed me. It moved toward me. The figure, its eyes still burning in the darkness, stepped closer, and I could hear the sound of something dragging along the floor. It was slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the moment, waiting for me to crumble. I could feel its presence closing in, its breath. No, it wasn't breathing, but the sensation of it was there. It was the cold of the shadows, the dampness of the walls closing in on me, until I could no longer tell where the building ended and the creature began. I opened my mouth, but again, nothing came out. I could only stare as it moved closer, those glowing eyes the last thing I would ever see. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, with that dark, formless thing in front of me. Every second felt like an eternity. My body was frozen in place, my legs screaming to move, but my mind refused to comply. The whispering had stopped, but the pressure in the air was suffocating. It was as if the very walls of the stairwell were closing in on me, pushing me, crushing me into this tight, unbearable space. And then, without warning, it moved. The creature's shape became clearer, its form stretching unnaturally in the dark. Its glowing eyes intensified, burning brighter, like twin lighthouses in an endless night. Its body undulated and shifted, twisting in grotesque ways that no human figure should. I could feel the air vibrating around me, as though the very air itself was alive with its presence. For a moment, I thought it was going to speak again, but it didn't. Instead, it tilted its head, a movement so smooth, so eerie, it sent chills crawling down my spine. It was studying me, its gaze piercing through me like it was trying to peel back every layer of my thoughts, my fears. I had never felt so seen, so exposed in my entire life. I felt it then. The subtle pressure, like something was pulling at the edges of my mind. It wasn't physical, no, it was something deeper. Something that gripped my soul, my very essence. A sickening wave of dizziness washed over me, making my vision blur. My breath came out in shallow, quick gasps, like I was drowning in the thick, heavy air of the stairwell. It wanted me. That thought cut through the fog in my mind. It wasn't a passive observer, it was hunting me. I could feel it now, that unnatural, predatory hunger in its gaze, in the stillness that surrounded us. The weight of it crushed me, every instinct screaming at me to flee, but my body betrayed me. I could feel my legs trembling, but they were too weak to move. I was trapped. And then it came closer. The sound of its movement was unnerving, like something skittering across a damp surface. Each step was slow, deliberate, as though it was savoring my terror. The cold, damp air grew colder with every inch it took toward me, and I could feel the walls closing in, narrowing the space between us. I could see it clearly now, the twisted shape of its body, its limbs far too long, too slender. Its skin, if that's what it could be called, was smooth, like dark rubber, glistening in the faint light from the flickering bulb above. And those eyes, had grown even brighter, almost burning in intensity, as if they were feeding off my fear. I couldn't look away, no matter how hard I tried. They were the only thing I could focus on, the only thing that existed in the overwhelming darkness of the stairwell. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. It was like the air had thickened to the point that I couldn't form any sound. My chest constricted, my heart thumping against my ribs. Then, a loud thud echoed through the stairwell, a sudden, sharp sound that shattered the stillness. It was followed by a quiet scraping noise, like nails dragging across stone. My body jerked in response, instinctively pulling away from whatever was approaching. But still, I couldn't move. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at that thing. How much time passed, minutes, hours. It felt like days. But then, finally, it reached me. Its presence was so overwhelming, so consuming, that I could feel it pressing against me. And then, the thing touched me. A cold, icy hand, or something like it, brushed against my arm. It wasn't a physical touch, not like any touch I had ever known. It was more like a sensation, something that seeped into my skin, chilling my very bones. My body convulsed in shock, but still, I couldn't move. I was utterly powerless. A voice, deep, guttural, like it was coming from the very depths of the earth, whispered in my ear, so close I could feel the cold breath on my neck. You can't escape. I felt it. The grip of its words, the truth of them. I was trapped in this nightmare. There was no escape. The stairwell, the building itself, seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions, but there was no way out. The air was thick with its presence, heavy with the knowledge that I was its prey. I felt my sanity slipping, the weight of the pressure almost too much to bear. It was too much, too overwhelming. I couldn't think straight anymore, couldn't process what was real and what wasn't. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred beyond recognition. In a final, desperate act, I forced myself to look away, to tear my gaze from those burning eyes. I had to focus. I had to find a way out. My body screamed in protest, but somehow I managed to step backward. One small movement, then another. The world around me seemed to warp as I did. I was moving, but I wasn't sure where I was going. My feet stumbled, tripping over something I couldn't see. But still, I moved. I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop moving, or it would get me. And then, just as I was about to reach the bottom of the stairs, the world shifted again. I don't know if it was the darkness, the building itself, or the creature, but everything around me twisted. The stairwell stretched before me, longer than it had been just moments ago. The door at the bottom of the stairs, my exit, was gone. The familiar walls had melted into a labyrinth of shadows, endless and suffocating. And that thing was still behind me, its presence so close I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. I had nowhere to run. The darkness around me twisted further, my vision warping with each frantic step I took. The stairwell stretched, contracting like it was alive, mocking my desperate attempts to escape. I could hear its presence growing closer with every passing second. A slow, rhythmic scraping sound, like nails dragging across stone, was now unmistakable. It was hunting me, following me, and with every second, my mind began to unravel a little more. My breathing was shallow, my lungs constricting as I staggered down the never-ending flight of stairs. My body moved on its own, driven by nothing but instinct and sheer terror. There was no escape. I could feel it. It was everywhere. The air around me seemed to thicken with a strange weight, and the familiar smell of musty concrete and old wood had transformed. Now, a pungent, rancid odor filled the space. It was sharp and metallic, like the scent of rusting iron mixed with something more organic. The stench burned my nostrils, forcing me to gag, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop running, couldn't stop moving. My heart raced, thundering in my chest like a wild animal trying to break free. I glanced behind me. The eyes. Those damn, glowing eyes. They were still there, burning through the blackness like twin flames. Every time I looked, they were a little closer. Every time I turned my head, I could feel it. It was watching me, studying me like prey. I stumbled, losing my footing. My hands scrambled against the cold, hard walls of the stairwell, desperate for something to steady myself. The stone felt slick beneath my fingertips, slick with a layer of something unknown. It almost felt like blood. My mind reeled. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think. I needed to escape, needed to get out, but the stairwell, it never seemed to end. The longer I ran, the darker it got, and the closer those eyes came. Please, God, no! A sharp, painful jolt shot through my chest as I tried to move faster. The panic, the overwhelming, suffocating panic, was all-consuming. My legs felt heavy, like they were being weighed down by concrete. My breaths were shallow, frantic gasps, but they weren't enough. Nothing was enough. And then I heard it. The sound I had been dreading. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy, echoed behind me. It was getting closer. It was right behind me now. That dark shape was so near, I could feel its presence crawling under my skin. My back prickled, like it was breathing on me. My skin turned cold, a layer of sweat forming as I fought to keep my legs moving. I couldn't breathe. My thoughts scrambled together in a mess of terror and desperation. I needed to find the door. I needed to. A sound. A whisper. It was too soft to hear at first, but it was there. My name. It was a low hiss, barely audible, but it rang in my ears like a death knell. I snapped my head around, but I saw nothing. The stairwell was still empty except for it. The eyes. The thing. That's when I realized. I wasn't running toward an exit. I wasn't running toward safety. I was running deeper into the heart of the thing. The stairwell had never been a means of escape. The exit at the bottom? Gone. The walls? They were closing in. There was no way out. The building was alive, shifting, tightening its grip on me with every step. It had been guiding me all along. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I stopped in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey. I stood there, trapped in the center of this nightmarish place, waiting for it to reach me. The shadows around me seemed to pulse, like they were breathing, like they were alive. And then it appeared. A figure. A shadow. At first, it was a blur, but as it drew closer, the details started to sharpen. The shape of its long, twisted limbs. Its body, more like a silhouette, wrapped in shadows, too dark to discern fully. But the eyes, those burning, glowing eyes. The air grew colder, colder than it had ever been. A freezing gust of wind whipped around me, but it was unnatural, as though it came from nowhere, from deep within the bowels of the building. The gust tore at my clothes, made my skin tingle, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. It was right there, inches from me. I could feel the heat radiating from its body, the overwhelming pull of its presence. I could see its outline now, a massive, hulking figure, too big for the stairwell, its limbs stretching unnaturally in ways that didn't make sense. Its face was a blur of darkness, except for those eyes. They were all I could see. And then, I heard the whisper again. Only this time, it wasn't in my ear. It wasn't soft. It was inside my head. You can't leave. You will never leave. The words echoed in my skull, as though they were reverberating in the walls of my mind. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but it was too late. I was too far gone. It had me. I felt its cold touch brush my arm, and then everything went black. The stairwell, the creature, the eyes, everything vanished. I woke up on the cold concrete floor, gasping for air, heart pounding. My eyes shot open, frantically searching the empty stairwell. The light above flickered as it had before. The walls stood still, silent. But the fear, the weight of it, it lingered. It never truly left. I stood, shaking, but I didn't dare take another step. I didn't know what was real anymore. Had I just dreamed it? Was it all in my head? My body felt wrong, like it had been touched by something I couldn't explain. Then, a sound, faint but unmistakable, reached my ears. A whisper. A hiss. You can't escape. And this time, it didn't come from behind me. It came from within. The thing had already taken me. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.